South Park is a crude show. This is an understatement. It is so much an understatement that even saying as such to a longtime fan or even creator involved that it is a crude show would not come across as a surprise or even an offensive or derogatory statement. It declares its crassness brazenly, from the language used to the glee with which it uses it. And of course, the most obvious way in which it declares its own depravity is through the art style used. I don't normally like to attribute a show's creation or success to a single creative or even a small group. A lot of people's work goes into the creation of a piece of media, from writers to storyboarders or directing, voice acting, animation, and so on. To say that a single mind or duo of minds can take full credit for anything is to discount the creativity and effort of so many other people. Although in the case of Matt Stone and Trey Parker, I find it slightly more reasonable to give them full credit for the show's creative direction and general vibe. South Park's first few pilot episodes were made using cut-out construction paper to give it a properly haphazard appearance, that it became beyond criticism as a result of looking like they weren't serious about presentation, visually or ideologically. But when the show was picked up for syndication, the creators found that this sort of handmade animation style was far too time-consuming, and instead switched to storyboarding on CorelDRAW and then finishing animation with Power Animator software in order to hasten development while still retaining the homemade look. In Season 5, the software was dropped for Autodesk Maya for extra versatility and even faster turnaround, with some episodes now taking less than 6 days to complete. But this wasn't all beneficial. While South Park was able to have episodes on current events come out the same week the story they were referencing happened, this also meant that the takes on these stories were often reactionary, and occasionally flat-out incorrect. As they were getting their news from the first responders instead of the people who took time to fact-check, South Park would occasionally get in trouble for being offensive and punching down at the wrong groups. But this ties back to the beginning, the fact that the show looked crude with the intention of offending people on purpose. It didn't matter that some people found issue with the subject matter. If anything, the protesting and controversy only added to the show's appeal, as it spread its popularity through word of mouth. All that said, South Park is a show that never tries to avoid controversy, and while I typically try to avoid self-censoring, I at least still make attempts to sanitize my language for a better viewing experience while still enabling myself to discuss the subject matter. This is less of a personal stance and more of an affordance to continue to make these videos without risking my channel's status. What I'm trying to get around to is the fact that I probably can't monetize this video as much as I want to, and since I really want to make the video anyway, it helps a lot if you join the channel membership to support me in a way other than ad revenue. Basically, joining the channel membership, in addition to all of the other perks, massively reduces the chance that I will have to unironically say the phrase, "Oh my god, they unalived Kenny." Of course, if you don't want to join the channel membership, there are also other ways to directly donate, like with a super thanks. I'm gonna need about $3.50. You might be preparing to leave a sardonic comment along the line stating that this video's title is a misnomer, that it is not actually brief. In addition to being overplayed, these comments, I feel, are actually incorrect. I go episode by episode giving a brief recap of the plot before doing a short dive into themes and character moments and larger cultural context. As each episode gets only a few minutes, this video genuinely is brief. The runtime is only large because of how many retrospectives I cram into a single video. Basically, this video is long, but it could be a lot longer. One more thing before I start. As I stated before, South Park is a crude show, and this sometimes means that particular episodes are little more than the sum of the shock value they contain. When I feel like an episode does not have much going for it thematically, I will note as such by making that episode's retrospective section much shorter than usual, rather than forcing myself to talk about nothing for 2 to 3 minutes. Anyway, without further ado, let's head on down to South Park to have ourselves a time. The Spirit of Christmas. Jesus vs. Frosty. The boys are constructing a snowman when Kyle tries to place a top hat on their creation. Stan warns him not to do this or else the snowman will come alive, something Kyle ignores. The snowman gets up, roaring at them and killing Cartman. Well, they call him Kenny. They run away, finding Santa and telling him about their problem until Santa too attacks them, killing, I guess Cartman. Finally, the two boys see a nativity scene and pray to Jesus. Jesus proceeds to stand upright and fights Frosty, throwing his halo at the snowman and slicing the hat clean off before returning to his manger. Stan and Kyle then talk about the real meaning of Christmas, not playing outside, but getting presents. Trey Parker and Matt Stone met at the University of Colorado, where they bonded over their love of Monty Python, producing The Spirit of Christmas together for fun, based on the paper animation occasionally featured in those films. To any longtime fan of the series, this initial short will stand out very clearly as an early installment with none of what we would later recognize. Only one boy is named, Kenny, and he has the appearance of the later Cartman. Kyle looks much more like Stan, and Kenny, future Kenny, has a visible face. The only thing this short gets right is the tone the early series would become famous for. Crude in construction and equal in tone, with more of an interest in shock value than telling a coherent story. It sets the bar low but clears it just fine, now serving as a silly thing to look back on, considering the later cultural resonance the series South Park would go on to have. The Spirit of Christmas, Jesus versus Santa. The boys are singing a Christmas carol when Stan points out that Kyle is Jewish and thus should be singing a Hanukkah song instead. Their argument is cut short by Jesus, who asks the kids for directions to the mall, but once they get there, they ask why he needed to go there, and Jesus says he wants vengeance against Santa for ruining his birthday. The two men proceed to fight with energy beams, killing several onlookers as well as Kenny. The fight breaks into a stalemate, with both Jesus and Santa asking the kids for help, and they wonder aloud, what would Brian Boitano do? Brian Boitano then skates by, telling the boys not to worry about hypotheticals and just to be good to each other, in the spirit of the season. So Kyle and Stan tell Santa that if it weren't for Jesus, the holiday wouldn't exist, and if it weren't for Santa, the spirit of Jesus' birthday would be gone. The two apologize and make up over an orange smoothie, as the boys ponder the real meaning of the holiday: presents. That is, until Kyle says that Jews get 8 days of presents instead of 1, and so they leave to celebrate Hanukkah. A few years after the first The Spirit of Christmas short was released, a mutual friend of Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who worked for the Fox Broadcasting Company, asked them to create another similar short as a Christmas card. This resulting short, Jesus vs. Santa, went on to be spread by word of mouth as one of the first viral videos of internet history. As a result, there were talks about having this short expanded into a full series on television, though disagreements with the crassness of the produced series eventually led to Fox dropping the idea and the duo cutting ties with the network. They then shopped the idea to both MTV and the fledgling Comedy Central, eventually settling on the latter over concerns that MTV might ask them to tone down the series a bit. The show did not perform well with test audiences, specifically among the female demographic, but due to the continuing popularity of the short online, the network eventually ordered 6 episodes that would make up part of the first season. What South Park would later gain a reputation for is finally on display in this short. Character names are correct, ethnicities are decided upon, and they even killed Kenny. There's a ton of senseless violence, not only in aesthetic sense, but in general as well. People are killed and the boys do not react. But the fight itself was pointless too. It's no surprise this was a viral video in the early aughts, as this is the exact kind of nihilistic edginess that defined that era of creativity. Stuff made for the sake of stuff instead of having some super deeper meaning behind why Brian Boitano appeared. Cartman gets an anal probe. The boys are waiting for the school bus, making fun of Cartman for dreaming of visitors, before Kyle's baby brother Ike starts to bother him. He tries to get rid of the infant with a game of kick the baby before the bus shows up, taking them to school where they witness the visitors abducting Ike. He worries that his parents are going to punish him for losing his sibling, but the bus driver, Miss Crabtree, and later their teacher Mr. Garrison, both refuse to let them out of school. It's not until they explain the situation to the chef, that he pulls the fire alarm to let them out, as he's excited to see the visitors for himself. They leave to find Ike, with Cartman still refusing to accept he was visited by aliens despite his flaming farts, and sudden desire to sing show tunes, even going as far as to ignore an alien laser that kills Kenny. Kyle tries to get Stan to go along, but as Stan received a letter from his crush, Wendy Testaberger, asking to meet him at Stark's Pond, they wait there for her first. But when Wendy hears of the situation, she gets the idea to use Cartman as bait for the visitors, and they go to his house to convince him to go with them. This plan works as a massive satellite pokes out of Cartman's butt and contacts the visitors. Kyle pleads with the aliens to return his brother, though it's only a misunderstanding as they were trying to communicate with cows, messing up and turning them inside out. As apology, the aliens give the cows a hypnosis machine that allows them to make the police do more show tunes as Wendy and Stan bond over various shapes in his nervous puke. There was an unaired version of this episode that included a few deleted scenes, as well as things that would later go on to be contradicted by the series as a whole. Cartman has an entire family, instead of simply living with his mother, shown to incessantly spoil him, explaining his behavior instead of simply having him be a rude child of his own volition. We also have a few cutscenes of other characters, including Pip showing some sympathy for Cartman's predicament, and some 5th graders forcing Cartman to eat hot tamales, explaining his fiery farts through the episode that way. And while some of these cut interactions are consistent with later characterization, this is far less to do with some elaborate character bible, and more to do with the creator simply writing jokes first and filling in personalities later. This can be seen more clearly with the actual plot of the episode, which, while containing several jokes that are still consistent with some of the show's most notable era, very few of these gags have anything to do with the plot itself. In one instance, this manifests as a literal fart joke taking over the plot on the early bus ride, Ike's disappearance taking a back seat to toilet humor, and Kenny's death being an elaborate gag, showing him survive one thing and then being killed by the next. Still, this is as South Park gets, with the crude designs complementing the gags and overall plot, so it's not as though anything is really meant to be taken seriously, at least not for now. Weight gain 4,000. Cartman wins an essay contest, with Kathie Lee Gifford coming over to South Park to personally give him an award in a televised event. But Wendy is upset, as Cartman doesn't seem to know anything about dolphins or the rainforest at all. Meanwhile, the whole town is preparing for the celebrity's arrival, with Mayor McDaniels planning a celebration by having Chef sing a song and Mr. Garrison put on a play with the kids. But Mr. Garrison, egged on by Mr. Hat, instead plans to assassinate Kathie Lee Gifford after remembering a childhood grudge as a result of her winning a talent show that he entered. Cartman is told by the mayor that he has to lose some weight for the televised event, so he buys a workout supplement and begins eating tons of it, as Mr. Garrison gets fired from the play for accurately portraying South Park's brutal history. Mr. Garrison then goes back to the assassination plan that Mr. Hat came up with, which is overheard by Wendy as she is investigating Cartman's essay, and she warns the others about it, heading to the Pook depository where Garrison is ready to shoot, merely waiting for Kathie Lee Gifford to leave her bulletproof glass bubble. But Wendy talks him out of the shot and he tries to put the gun down, only for Mr. Hat to take the shot anyway. But the stage breaks under Cartman's weight, and the bullet hits Kenny instead, with Kathie Lee Gifford being taken to safety. With no more celebrity, everyone goes home before they can hear Wendy's prove that Cartman cheated on his essay, and they all leave to have tuna fish sandwiches as Cartman eventually gets his wish of appearing on television due to being morbidly obese. This episode nearly instantly has a lot of South Park staples with very little of the awkward growing pains that many shows have to deal with in their first seasons. The plot revolves around a celebrity appearance with little to do with the actual celebrity and could be anyone. Each character ignores the much more pressing thing they need to do for some personal reasons, be it Stan following Wendy instead of his planned clinging onto Cartman's TV appearance, or Cartman putting on tons of weight as he assumes that he is underweight due to watching a TV commercial targeted at adults. In fact, it's just Wendy who is responsible in this episode, trying to stop the assassination attempt and failing because Mr. Hat took over after he was enraged by Stan's excitement caught from the rest of the town. The town itself is also beginning to be established in this episode. People quickly obsess over some celebrity they've gotten the chance to meet with. As I said earlier, Kathie Lee Gifford and her career have nothing to do with her appearance, which contributes to the absurdity of the episode. She's famous for being famous here. No one mentions Regis or her charity work. It helps to show the shallowness of the people meant to represent the typical American in South Park through the mayor, herself only aspiring to get out of there. Volcano. The boys go on a hunting trip with Stan's uncle Jimbo and his old war buddy Ned. Jimbo teaches them the basics of hunting, specifically that they can shoot any animal that's coming right at them, as well as how to get drunk around a campfire. Stan starts to feel self-conscious over the fact that he doesn't want to kill any of the animals, and that Jimbo's more impressed by Kenny's antics, declaring him his honorary nephew. Also feeling upset is Cartman, as the other boys teased him for his mother-coddling behavior, and the fact that his campfire story about Scuzzlebutt was not scary. So to get back at them, Cartman dresses as Scuzzlebutt and tries to scare them with wicker baskets, only for the hunting party to try to shoot at him, chasing Cartman further and further up the mountain. Meanwhile, Randy discovers seismic activity and finds out that the local volcano is about to explode. He warns the mayor, who calls the news vans over to get a bit of fame as she leads the people in rescuing the boys / building a big trench to divert the lava. The boys eventually corner Scuzzlebutt, who reveals that he is Cartman, before the volcano begins to erupt, chasing them back down the mountain where they are trapped behind the trench. Then, the real Scuzzlebutt emerges from the wood and transports them to safety in a wicker basket before Stan shoots him. Realizing they don't know the difference between what's right and what's wrong to shoot, Ned and Jimbo throw down their guns, shooting Kenny in the process. Contrary to his later depiction, Randy Marsh here cares little about the erupting volcano, his reaction to seeing an apocalyptic event being to sip his coffee a bit. Later seasons will show him as the typical instigator of plots, usually with the opposite reaction of freaking out and making a huge deal over nothing. Who does make a huge deal over nothing, though, is the mayor, shown once again to use tragedy as a means of getting some positive media attention. This attention ironically manages to actually save the day, with the gathered people being able to dig a trench that saves the town, although not Denver. The other half of this episode is dedicated to the hunting party, specifically the way in which Jimbo uses hunting as a way to get the kids to man up, rewarding Kenny for drinking gasoline, making dirty jokes, and killing everything he sees. It's not until Stan shoots Scuzzlebutt after he saves their lives that the other men realize that maybe killing something doesn't actually make you a better person, and that constantly acting out for attention is a childish thing to do, whether it is Stan trying to impress his uncle, or his uncle trying to impress a bunch of 9-year-olds. Big Gay Al's Big Gay Boat Ride. Stan gets a new dog, Sparky, showing him off to his friends right up until Sparky starts to hump another male dog, revealing him as gay. This fear over his dog being gay causes him to get distracted during football practice, concerning as the South Park Cows are soon going to play the Middle Park Cowboys, and Stan is supposed to be their star quarterback. He asks Mr. Garrison about what he should do, and Garrison says gay people are evil. And Stan, repeating how he doesn't want Sparky to be gay, makes the dog run away, where he then discovers Big Gay Al's Big Gay Animal Sanctuary. Stan eventually tracks him down to this sanctuary, where he eventually learns to accept his dog for who he is, and to stop trying to force him to be straight. Back at the school, the Cows are struggling to beat the 70-point spread against the Cowboys, which is concerning as Jimbo convinced the people to bet on their local team, even going as far as to plant a bomb on the mascot just in case. But Stan returns and manages to win the game with a pass to Kyle, and as he celebrates, tells everyone that being gay is okay before reuniting the town with their abandoned gay pets. In the end, the Cowboys mascot explodes when John Stamos' brother sings the high note in Loving You. This episode ends on the song with credits, Now You're a Man, Manny Manny, Man Man Man, and so on. What's considered manly in this episode is playing sports. What is not considered manly is being gay, at least to those who are super concerned with coming across as manly. In this case, the closeted types like Mr. Garrison, whose deflection about his sexuality comes out in the form of extra bigotry towards the sexual minority he's in denial of being. The other manly characters here are depicted as the kind of guys who are okay with kids being torn apart in contact sports, calling Pip weak for wanting to wear a helmet, and ignoring Kenny getting torn limb from limb during the game because it's just manly stuff. The non-manly gay characters are the ones who are happier. Big Gay Al runs a magical animal sanctuary and throws disco parties. The animals love him because he's genuinely caring. This is in contrast to Stan, who goes from declaring Sparky as his very best friend until he learns his dog is gay, at which point he convinces the dog to run away by badmouthing it. It's not until Stan learns not to be judgmental that he's finally able to have a proper happy ending with this new best friend, and then the opposing team's mascot explodes when John Stamos' brother hits a high note. An elephant makes love to a pig. Kyle has a new pet elephant, but his parents won't let him keep it in the house. But when he learns about genetic engineering in class, he gets the idea to crossbreed his pet elephant with Cartman's pig Fluffy, to make an elephant that fits inside the house. This is even suggested as a science fair project, competing against Terrance's project to create a human clone. But when they go to Dr. Mephisto's manor and see all his genetic experiments, mostly animals with 4 butts, they're turned off of the idea and, at Chef's advice, decide to crossbreed the animals the old-fashioned way, by getting them really drunk. But while the boys were at the genetic cloning lab, Mephisto took some of Stan's DNA for his son's project, and this slowly becomes a giant deformed Stan. When this deformed Stan breaks out of its captivity, it starts to terrorize the city, with Stan getting all of the blame. But Stan has the idea to convince his clone to beat up his sister Shelly, who's been bullying him all episode, but when they arrive he simply trashes the house and kills Kenny. Shelly winds up punching out the clone, who is later killed by Mephisto for only having 1 ass, though she covers for Stan when his angry parents get home. In the end, Terrance is able to present an even better science project, a monkey with 5 butts, while Fluffy gives birth to a pig that looks like Mr. Garrison, who gives him an A+. This episode's title did not originally say Makes Love to a Pig, with Comedy Central changing it to be more appropriate, ironically creating a much more bizarre title, as what happens cannot really be considered making love. Another censored moment comes from the second fight scene between Stan and his sister, when she lights him on fire multiple times before putting him out. In original airings of the episode, this scene was taken out, but the puddle of water beneath them remained, though remasters have reanimated a lot since then. The reason this was censored was more realistic, though. There was a recent case in the news of a trailer home burning down as a result of a kid playing with matches after seeing Beavis and Butthead doing the same thing, and Comedy Central did not want to risk a repeat incident. Sure, it's not like Beavis and Butthead are supposed to be good role models, but then again, children are not great at picking out who they idolize. This is true in-universe as well, with the kids getting pressured into a competition to make their genetic engineering experiment instead of a more natural flow of interest. This results in both groups pushing their experiment far beyond what's natural, resulting in a monstrous Stan terrorizing South Park. And while it seems like there's going to be a moral at a few points in the episode about Stan not getting back at his sister because they're family, South Park passes up the chance to make this point. Not that it needed to put more gags in about Stan getting beaten up by his older sister, and Cartman being a hypocrite about women. Death. Stan's grandpa keeps asking Stan to end his life, though Stan is hesitant to do so, as he's more concerned in watching Terrance and Phillip, a show about farting Canadians. But when Kyle's mom learns what her son is watching, she goes on a crusade to warn the other parents about the swearing and fart jokes. Everyone gets mad at Kyle, though Stan is more concerned with trying to get an answer from the adults as to whether it's moral to assist someone in suicide, a question they won't touch with the 20-foot pole. Eventually, as the parents are organizing against Terrance and Phillip, the kids are left alone with Stan's grandpa as he tries to hang himself, and the kids get in trouble, with the parents marching to the network's HQ to protest. This leaves the kids alone again, so Grandpa pulls Stan into a room and makes him listen to Enya so he can understand what it's like to be old, and Stan finally relents and agrees to kill his grandpa. But before they can do this, Death appears and chases them around, ultimately killing Kenny, but not Grandpa, who's told by the ghost of his grandfather not to traumatize his children. In the end, the protest is ended when the diarrhea the protesters got from Kenny stinks up the area outside the network's headquarters, and he agrees to take Terrance and Phillip off the air. With no more fart show to laugh at, the kids decide to try drugs and porn instead. This episode briefly makes a moral about the parents ignoring their kids' cry for help as they're being attacked by Death due to the ongoing protest, arguing that the entire protest is just a way to divert responsibility away from themselves for having the TV do the parenting for them. The obvious analogy is to South Park itself, with Terrance and Phillip serving as a stand-in for the show. Parents ought to be less concerned with what the kids are watching than that they are watching it. This isn't as though there's a shortage of other TV shows available, many of which are specifically targeted to kids. Of course, all of this is compounded by the fact that Terrance and Phillip is not meant to be viewed as prestige television. The characters' mouths coming detached like that was originally meant to portray the cartoon as being crudely animated. It was only later that this was retconned to mean Canadian. This combines with the fact that the kids are actually being affected by the TV they watch. When Cartman's mother tells him not to watch Terrance and Phillip, he curses her out repeatedly using the same language he saw on TV. And sure, parents should monitor what their kids are watching, but if parents were monitoring their kids 24/7, that would be smothering to their development. Pinkeye. Kenny is crushed by a falling space station and taken to the morgue where one of the morticians leaves out a bottle of Worcestershire sauce that gets into the embalming fluid, turning Kenny into a zombie. He shows up at school with parts of him falling off as he bites kids, though his friends are more concerned with the costume contest, where Wendy has dressed like everyone else using a Chewbacca mask instead of doing a couple's costume with Stan, all while Cartman gets in trouble for dressing as Adolf, shown an uninformative video on why that's bad, and then getting a ghost costume instead. The zombie outbreak is misdiagnosed as Pinkeye, though Chef knows better and takes the kids to the morgue to investigate the source of the zombies. They eventually learn about the appended sauce bottle and call the hotline on the back, where Kyle is told to kill the original zombie to stop the outbreak. They killed Kenny, again, and the zombies turn back to normal. In the end, while mourning Kenny's death, they discuss the true meaning of the holiday, except they get it mixed up with Christmas. Cartman goes to school dressed as Hitler, getting told off by the staff for doing so and pulled into the principal's office to learn why he should not have done that. Except they really only told him not to do it, without actually going into depth the reason why this is not okay to do. The result is him sitting in a room and being shown footage of soldiers marching as he speaks to them, the exact sort of propaganda used to support the party in the first place. Cartman did not listen to the arguments and simply saw something he thought looked cool, and ran with it. It's something I've said before, but kids are not great at picking out role models. They're just going to side with the coolest looking guy, or whoever yells the loudest, or whoever makes them laugh. This episode ends with a mirror to the Spirit of Christmas shorts where the boys parrot their lesson learned from back then, only to realize they have the wrong holiday, the entire point of the episode effectively being nullified then and there. The "I learned something today" recaps at the end of episodes have always been gags meant to show the boys taking the wrong lesson entirely, so it's not a surprise that the writers are already pointing out how pointless these are in such a tongue-in-cheek way. Starvin Marvin. While watching the Terrance and Phillip Thanksgiving special, the boys see a commercial to support starving families in Ethiopia and decide to donate so they can get a sports watch. But instead of the watch, an Ethiopian child is sent over. They name him Starvin Marvin and take him to school where the faculty says they cannot raise him. Later, when the Red Cross arrives to fix the mix-up, Marvin points to Cartman as the starving African child, and he's taken to Ethiopia instead. While there, he looks for food, finding nothing from the Red Cross as they've run out of funding, but finding a cache of food from Sally Struthers, who's been hoarding it. Meanwhile, Dr. Mephisto is trying to warn the mayor about an outbreak of angry turkeys, though she is more concerned with a canned food drive. But when this canned food drive is interrupted by the mob, Chef has to rally the people Braveheart style to fight back against them. They have a great fight scene, ultimately winning at a great cost, only for more Red Cross members to finally pick up Marvin for real, with Marvin taking the dead turkeys back home with him and managing to feed his people. The boys adopt a child from Ethiopia with all the treatment and enthusiasm one might use to adopt an animal, with a similar response from the adults in their life. No, you can't adopt that child, the adults say, only to deflect away reasons why they themselves cannot also take care of them by saying they're already doing their part. This part is sending a small donation to a charity that ultimately winds up eaten by a celebrity, rather than donated more directly to do some good. People are less interested in helping than they are in appearing to help, or to get a watch. When it comes time to make sacrifices that are any more substantial than a monthly donation, people deflect. And the episode itself doesn't necessarily condemn this behavior. Would the world really be a better place if every starving kid were shipped overseas? The Americas have tried this once through a system that wound up with residential schools that wiped out cultures in an attempt to civilize indigenous people, blaming their poor conditions on things inherent to race rather than socioeconomic factors. Not that South Park ever looked any more deeply into these aspects of society. Poverty in Africa is viewed more as a humorous inevitability than the result of political strife or a civil war, while still being something preferred by Marvin over the bizarre behavior of the Western world of South Park. Mr. Hankey. Kyle's mom gets upset when she sees Mr. Garrison directing the Christmas play as they're making her Jewish son talk about Jesus. The other kids start to treat him like an outcast, made worse when he tries to explain the concept of Mr. Hankey the Christmas Poo. Meanwhile, Kyle's mom and all the other citizens of South Park start to complain to the mayor about Christmas, who responds by trying to come up with as non-denominational a holiday celebration as possible. Kyle keeps seeing Mr. Hankey, getting the idea to take him to school to show the other kids he's real, though all they see is a regular turd, which gets Kyle committed when Mr. Hankey attacks Cartman. The day of the holiday pageant comes with a performance by Phillip Glass as the kids meander around in gray leotards, a pageant so bad that the citizens of South Park start to blame each other for neutering it. This angry mob is finally calmed down by Mr. Hankey himself, who sings a holiday song and gets everyone to visit Kyle, who then is let out as people realize he told the truth all along. The episode ends with Kenny not dying, and Jesus singing happy birthday to himself. This episode's plot is based on the claim that it's impossible to do anything anymore without offending at least someone, unless you walk on eggshells and police your own language so as not to offend. But if you manage to successfully do this, you wind up saying nothing of substance at all, as all you can produce is tame, inoffensive, and thus boring content. As is typical of the show, they portray these arguments in a way that sides with nobody and pokes fun at every group involved. The people demanding change got the change they wanted, but then so did everyone else as well, so the end result made everyone mad. It turns out that the people pushing for tamer, more universal content consider their own experiences to be universal and tame. Inoffensive is just code for whatever the person speaking considers normal. In this case, the people arguing for normalcy are the ones celebrating Christmas in the traditional sense, with the traditional sense meaning the way they usually do it. As long as you are 51% of the population, your beliefs and behaviors are normal. But if you're 49% of the population, then you have to stop cramming your politics down other people's throats and accept that the season's not about you. It's not as though South Park really does take the position that people ought to shut up and conform to the local way of doing things, though. Kyle's made fun of at the start of the episode for no reason other than the fact that he is Jewish. So his mom sort of has a point in that the larger group is just using culture wars as a way to bully smaller groups. But in the end, whether or not somebody is offended isn't something to be concerned with, as someone will be offended no matter what. The best solution is to offend everyone equally, something that Mr. Hankey the Christmas Pooh promises. Damien. A new kid arrives at school, Damien, the son of Satan, and Cartman gives everyone but him and Pip a birthday party invitation, as well as a list of the gifts they have to give him. Damien starts cursing people, even turning Kenny into a duck-billed platypus, and he demands to see Jesus. When Jesus hears the call-out, he arrives at South Park Elementary and hears that the Dark Lord himself will soon be there, and that he wants to fight Jesus one-on-one for the souls of everyone in town. During the weigh-in, people worry that Satan is much larger, and they all bet on him, much to Jesus' annoyance as he calls them out at a bar. Cartman is furious as his big birthday party is taking place on the same day as the fight, more so when his birthday party starts and Kyle gets him ants in the pants instead of the Mega Man he wanted. Cartman shuts down his birthday party, so everyone goes to see the fight instead, arriving just in time to give Jesus a motivational speech stolen from Star Trek. Jesus throws a single punch and knocks out Satan, though it's revealed that he threw the fight on purpose, as he was the only one who bet on Jesus to win. Satan brags about ripping off the people of South Park to become rich, and he returns to hell, taking Damien with him just after the kid got some acceptance for blowing up Pip. This episode doesn't say too much. It's got a few callbacks to the original shorts, even a scene paralleling Jesus looking angrily at the people cheering against him as they awkwardly shut up about it. In the last case, it was the kids rooting for the man who gives them presents, while now it's the people rooting for a man who they bet money on. Really, though, the consistent thing shown here is that bullies tend to win in the end. Damien is not accepted by the other kids and starts to bond with Pip over this, at least until he gets the idea to light the kid on fire and shoot him into the sky. Once he starts picking on other kids, he's no longer at the bottom of the social hierarchy, and he gets accepted. Likewise, Satan harasses Jesus and acts like a big tough guy, ultimately winning a ton of money and throwing a fight to take money from people who preferred evil over good, in spite of the fact that they'd all be damned to hell for eternity if Satan won. Every person figured that, as long as they were rich, they would probably be less affected by the millennia of torment. It's a very American way of thinking that's criticized here, that no matter how bad things get, it's better to improve your own station in life, to avoid the worst of it, rather than trying to prevent the world from going to hell in the first place. It doesn't matter that the kids are always bullying each other, as long as you yourself do not get harassed, then the system is fine. Tom's Rhinoplasty. Mr. Garrison takes time off work to get surgery, and a new substitute teacher, Miss Ellen, takes his place. All the boys in Garrison's class are smitten with her, much to the annoyance of Wendy, who tries to win back Stan by threatening the new teacher. Among the boys smitten with Miss Ellen is Chef, who woos her with the song and takes her out on a date that night, only to tell the boys the next morning that she is a lesbian, and only wants to date other lesbians. So the boys try to become lesbians using advice from Cartman's mom, as Stan wins a date with her for having the highest grade on a spelling test. Ultimately, Wendy decides to stop fighting for Stan's affection and apologizes to Miss Ellen, until the next day when she is taken away by the Iraqi government, with Kinney dying in the scuffle and shot into the sun on a rocket for her unexplained crimes. Meanwhile, Mr. Garrison has gotten his surgery, a nose job, and now looks exactly like David Hasselhoff. He quits his job teaching to be a model until a mob of women attacks him in the street, and he changes his mind. In the end, it's revealed that the Iraqi government and the mob of women were both in Wendy's employ as a part of an elaborate scheme to win back Stan. The Wendy established in this episode is not the same Wendy we see through the rest of the series, her masterminding of elaborate revenge schemes disproportionate to how wronged she is, being more of a trait of Eric Cartman than anyone else. We do see later on that she's never the type to take abuse lying down, but these reactions are still tempered by the bounds of reality, Wendy serving as a source of common sense. This, at least, is something consistently shown, with the way she's the only one to identify incoming problems before they get worse, be this by getting upset with an alien invasion, or by discovering Cartman's plagiarism before. Mecha-Streisand. While on a school archaeology dig, Cartman finds a mysterious triangle, though he throws it away and Kyle takes it. But the news reports on this triangle, making Cartman jealous enough to steal it back, which he attempts to do, only for Kyle to just give him the thing to leave him alone. Also interested in this triangle is Barbara Streisand and Leonard Maltin, who tracks down Chef to find and save the boys before Streisand takes the triangle, actually half of a diamond called the Triangle of Zinthar. Streisand kidnaps the boys and takes them to her $4 million condo in the mountains, where she sings to them to get information on the location of the artifact, which Cartman hands over. Now in possession of the triangle, she transforms into Mecha-Streisand and begins to destroy the town of South Park again. Leonard Maltin transforms into Ultraman, while Sidney Poitier turns into Gamera, though they're both pushed away. It's ultimately Mothra Robert Smith who is able to punch her weak spot and knock the triangle out of her nose before saving the day and walking into the sunset. Kyle throws out the triangle, saying that people who lust for power are the least deserving of it, before Ike finds the artifact and transforms into a giant. There's little to say about this episode that's not already abundantly self-evident. South Park has a few episodes that can best be described as shitposting, and this is one of them. Mecha-Streisand is just a way for Matt and Trey to trash-talk celebrities they don't like while showing off how cool the ones they do like are. Kyle saying he loves The Cure is just Matt Stone speaking his own opinion. Other than celebrities, this episode also features a few of the other South Park touches of affection. The Japanese lyrics sung whenever there's a transformation sequence are real Japanese, either katakana easternizations of English words or simple phrases like "your heart is black" or "your nose is big." Trey Parker is fluent in Japanese and is a Japanophile from the days before the term weeaboo was ever uttered. Cartman's mom is a wind through Wide Valley. Cartman has been acting strange and missing school lately, so the boys get Mr. Maggie's video camera to get footage of this behavior so Maggie can better diagnose him. They then capture footage of him having a tea party with the dolls, later going on to ask his mother about the identity of his father. Cartman is then told the story about how his mother met him, flashing back to a party where she met a Native American chief, who directs Cartman to Chef, who directs Cartman to Mr. Garrison, who directs him to the 1991 Denver Broncos. Mr. Mephisto then offers to do a DNA test of the suspects to learn the identity of Cartman's father, though he does not have the $3,000 necessary to pay for this. That is, until Stan and Kyle admit that they submitted the footage of Cartman's tea party to America's Stupidest Home Movies, with the hope of winning a $10,000 prize. This prize instead goes to Grandpa Marsh, who sent in footage of Kinney dying in a train crash, though they at least have the money to pay for the test as a runner-up prize. Mr. Mephisto gets everybody from that party together and prepares to reveal the identity of Cartman's father, only to reveal that the truth will come out next season. The first act of this episode establishes Cartman's pattern of misbehavior insofar as he is playing with dolls who all unanimously agree that he's very cool, his reaction to the tea party being shown on television proving that even he knows this is abnormal. More pressing, it's not funny abnormal, like Kenny getting killed every episode. As I mentioned before, Cartman's father disappeared between early versions of the first episode, his lack of existence now explained as the reason Cartman is so coddled and spoiled all the time. So this episode exists to answer the question raised only by people who are obsessed with unreleased footage to explain a mystery that nobody asked: who is Cartman's father? Terrance and Phillip in Not Without My Anus. Instead of learning the identity of Cartman's real father, we are instead treated to a Terrance and Phillip special about farts. A man named Scott accuses Terrance of murder, though Phillip is able to make the jury laugh by farting to get his friend out of the sentence. Scott vows revenge and plots with Saddam Hussein to get that revenge. He does this by kidnapping Terrance and Celine Dion's daughter while she is studying abroad and holding her hostage, sneaking a bunch of soldiers aboard their plane on the return flight. These soldiers then take over Canada bit by bit, interrupting their craft dinner as well as Ugly Bob's affair with Celine Dion, to force her to sing the Iraqi national anthem instead of the Canadian one at a football game. Scott decides instead to give Terrance and Phillip a bomb to strap to their chests to take out the dictator and themselves, though they have a better idea. On the day of the game, just as Celine starts to sing, every Canadian begins farting enough to fill the stadium with gas and kill the soldiers, singing "Oh Canada" as the camera pans away, and Scott learns a lesson about how farting is legitimate humor. A quick April Fool's joke released between acts of a two-parter designed to troll viewers into thinking that it was a different type of April Fool's joke. Terrance and Phillip has always been a show within the show of South Park, making it appear like this would just be another of the show's 10-second cutaway gags before getting to the real plot, something even teased in the episode itself as they watch South Park on their couch and cut away just before the reveal of Cartman's father. Anyway, on to the real show. Cartman's mom is still, and so on. The episode opens on Mephisto about to reveal the identity of Cartman's father when he is suddenly shot through a window, falling unconscious. They rush him to the hospital in spite of Stan's fear of hospitals and Cartman's inability to avoid singing "Come Sail Away," where the sole doctor there is unable to treat him and the other patients properly due to power failures caused by a snowstorm. This snowstorm has also trapped many South Park residents in a soundstage that is filming a reenactment of the crime scene for America's Most Wanted, forcing the citizens to resort to cannibalism, even though only a few hours have passed. Back at the hospital, the doctor puts Kenny in charge of fixing the backup generator as they drink cocoa, and he manages to do this by using his body to connect the circuits, dying by electrocution. Mephisto is able to be resuscitated, revealing that it was probably just his brother trying to kill him as he does once a month, and he is finally able to reveal the name of Eric Cartman's father, Mrs. Cartman. It turns out that she, in addition to sleeping her way to President Clinton to convince him to allow 40th trimester adoption, is a hermaphrodite and thus Eric's actual father. When it's time to reveal who Eric's mother is, he decides that it's not worth finding out and gives up. After a slight delay, the audience finally gets to find out just who it was that caught Cartman's mother pregnant all those years ago, but first, another slight delay as we get to solve a brand new murder mystery, and then watch a harrowing tale of survival. A tale of survival that only lasted a few hours, and a mystery that was dismissed as unimportant by the man in the middle of it all. After delaying the reveal of the mystery for 4 months, the showrunners then delayed it by another week for a Terrance and Phillip special, and then delayed it by another 22 minutes with a series of gags about how needlessly complex shows sometimes have to be to maintain an aura of mystery that keeps the audience hooked. And why do they do this? For Matt and Trey, it's just a bit of trolling, but for characters in-universe, it's a means of extracting more value from a simple story. Who shot Mr. Mephisto? A television executive thinks that dragging out a dramatic story instead of a proper investigation would solve the problem. Not the problem of not knowing the answer, but the problem of the answer not making any money should it be revealed. In the end, South Park understands that a bunch of paper cutouts in a fake town are just that, and there is not real value in learning the precise identities of fictional characters, and thus, there should not be some huge prestige mystery behind it. Chickenlover. While the kids are in a bookmobile, they hear a chicken screaming and head over to investigate the noise, arriving at the same time as Officer Barbrady, who is in the middle of hyping up a cops segment about himself. The camera crew leaves as Barbrady learns of the crime. Someone made love to a chicken, and when he's gathering clues, including a note confessing to the crime, it eventually comes out that he cannot read. he retires in shame, with South Park devolving into chaos until the mayor sends him to South Park Elementary to learn to read. He struggles for a while until the kids offer help, with Cartman being deputized as the others teach him the words on various books used as clues by the Chickenlover. They're eventually able to stake out the petting zoo after reading a book about one, where Barbary catches the Chickenlover in the act, revealed as the man driving the bookmobile from the start, who had sex with chickens as an elaborate plan to teach the officer how to read. Cartman, who has spent the episode demanding that people respect his authority, is de-deputized, and the episode ends with a parade for Barbary, who announces that reading sucks after reading Ayn Rand. There's always a desire by some writers to make stories more complex as a means of making stories better, as if the harder it is to follow along with various master plans, the better the story is. In South Park, a character comes up with a plan to teach Officer Barbary how to read that begins before he ever revealed that he couldn't. Narratively, this is treated as though it was some sort of masterful manipulation, which is simultaneously enough to let the Chickenlover get away with his crimes, as though he did the wrong thing for the right reason instead of sexually assaulting chickens and then making something up to get away with it afterwards. Ike's Wee-Wee. Kyle is inviting the other students to his brother Ike's bris, though they are unaware what a circumcision is, as Chef refuses to explain. Kyle mistakenly deduces that it is similar to a castration, so he fakes Ike's death to keep him away from his parents by taking his brother to Nebraska. But during a mock funeral for an Ike dummy that was mauled by a dog, he sees a Canadian flag on the tombstone and learns that Ike was adopted. He reveals the truth to his parents, angry that his brother is not his brother, until Ike is brought back, cowering with his sibling for safety from the rabbi, who later clears up the situation as Kyle decides that family is more than blood. During an anti-drug PSA, Mr. Mackey passes a small amount of marijuana around the classroom, which ends up disappearing. For giving the kids drugs, he is fired from his job and soon becomes an outcast by the citizens of South Park. He hides from their taunts in a bar where he is given a beer and later harder alcohol, which causes him to return home drunk and learn that his landlord kicked him out. He wakes up in an alley, being offered some drugs to stay warm and winding up with some old students he suspended who offer him more. Eventually he meets a hippie woman and the two decide to get married, vacationing in India, where Mackey is kidnapped by the A-Team and dragged back to South Park for rehab. Eventually he returns to his old job, once again teaching the kids that drugs are bad, okay? This episode starts out because Chef refuses to tell the children what a circumcision is, telling them rightfully that they ought to ask their parents these sort of questions instead of random adults. But rather than heeding this advice, Stan asks a few other random kids and ends up getting a fake answer. A fake answer he then bases the rest of his actions off of, until Kyle discovers that Ike is not actually his younger brother. The episode then changes subjects, with Kyle wondering if it's worth it to protect his brother, knowing that they're not blood-related. It's not until Ike treats Kyle like they're still brothers that he realizes his error, that the feelings he had when he wanted to protect Ike are still there regardless of factual relationships. Mr. Mackey ends up going down a spiral of addiction as drugs ruin his life, or at least that is how the town portrays his actions following him getting fired. In reality, he was fired before taking any drugs and only ever drank to cope with that, and smoked to cope with losing his house, something that only happened because his landlord assumed he was an addict. People always say that doing drugs will ruin your life, and half the reason this is true is because the people saying that will ruin your life if you do drugs. Drinking did not make Mackey's landlord change the locks. Smoking didn't make him sleep on the streets. In fact, he fell in love and got married due to a shared love of drug culture and had been clean for a while afterwards. Sure, there are plenty of drugs out there that are genuinely harmful, but as a society, more of the harm of doing drugs comes from people treating you like an addict rather than a person. Conjoined Fetus Lady. Pip breaks Stan's nose during a dodgeball game after he's compared to the French, and Stan is sent to the nurse's office, discovering that the school nurse, Miss Gollum, has conjoined twin dyslexia. They all make fun of her, which Kyle's mom overhears, encouraging the town to do something about it. Despite Nurse Gollum insisting that she does not want special treatment, they host an entire week dedicated to her that culminates in hats, parades, and an invasive slideshow. Meanwhile, South Park has been invited to play in a state championship dodgeball game, and Coach Chef is excited for the kids to play, despite learning later that no one else wanted to play the state championship because Denver's team was too good and it was sure to win. but with Pip's rage they manage to make it to Nationals, and then to the World Championship against the Chinese when no one else wants to play there. The Chinese team has been trained from birth to be the best, and they maim most of the South Park kids, even killing Kenny. Chef realizes that he was forcing his dream onto the kids, and they agree to stop caring about the game, despite the fact that Pip managed to win with French rage. They return to South Park in the midst of the festivities in time to hear Nurse Gollum yell at the town for singling her out, the last thing she wanted. The kids realize that she is alright after all, as the adults consider her ungrateful. Despite the A and B plot hardly interacting, both of these plots still have the same general message, that of people in charge having desires that contradict what the people they're in charge of want. This disparity comes from a difference in outcome versus the path to that outcome. Chef and the mayor are looking at the end goal, either to win a championship or to prove how accepting they are of Nurse Gollum. Despite the fact that this championship comes at the cost of injuring the kids and having them travel around the country against their will does not come up, nor does the fact that Nurse Gollum never wanted to be singled out in the first place. Sure, the kids were making fun of her, but kids make fun of everything, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't still hang out together. The main four even make fun of each other constantly, making fun of Kyle for being Jewish, Cartman for being fat, and Kenny for being poor. It's even making fun of Pip that gets them to win the world tournament, and then Nurse Gollum reveals that she never really cared that she was being teased, as she had long since accepted it. The kids realize she was actually cool all along, and their position of Nurse Gollum flips with that of the adults, who are mad that their self-serving charity work was not appreciated enough. The Mexican Staring Frog of Southern Sri Lanka. The boys get an F- for retelling one of Jimbo's Vietnam stories for a report, so as revenge they make fake footage of the Mexican Staring Frog of Sri Lanka, sending an increasingly absurd proof of the frog's existence before ultimately calling in a fake tip about the frog's location. Jimbo flashbangs Ned while trying to follow one of these leads, leaving him catatonic. Meanwhile, the producer of Jesus and Pals is trying to come up with a way to increase ratings for the show to compete with Jimbo's Huntin' and Killin', when she overhears Stan apologizing for hospitalizing Ned. She decides to host their apology on Jesus' show, telling the men to lie more and more to one-up each other, in order to make a big fight that's ultimately stopped by Jesus, who gets to the bottom of all of the lies told thus far. Jimbo apologizes for embellishing his story, and the kids apologize for escalating, as the producer is sent to hell to be tortured by Satan and his boyfriend Saddam. A pretty absurd story with little to say outside of condemning exaggerations made by network executives to sell advertising space. There's an especially poignant line spoken by Huntin' and Killin's executive after saying they have higher ratings than ever. When Jimbo asks if that means he'll make more money, the executive replies, "No, but I will," meaning that Jimbo is effectively selling out his dignity to make somebody else rich. It's still viewed as a little bit better than the boys making themselves look dumb for no gain at all, although they at least assumed they wouldn't have to come clean. And this is then compared to Jesus, who never wanted to sell out and only begrudgingly did so to keep his ratings high enough to help other people. City on the Edge of Forever. While taking a winding detour through the mountains, the school bus slides off a cliff and falls for a while before winding on the edge of another cliff. Miss Crabtree tells the kids to sit down and shut up, or else a monster will eat them, before leaving to find help. She's picked up by a trucker who takes her to a nearby town where her screaming is appealing to the audience, eventually having her impress people until she gets a talk show appearance on Jay Leno, before finally realizing that fame is fleeting and retiring to spend more time with her new boyfriend Marcus, the truck driver. Meanwhile, the kids are trapped on the bus, with one child braving the wilderness despite Crabtree's warning and getting eaten by the monster. So the other kids reminisce on various events in their lives by flashing back to earlier episodes, though they misremember every ending as including ice cream, and add a few new scenes altogether. Ultimately, when the kids use the bus's TV to see what's going on in the outside world, they find their parents have assumed they ran away, putting on a TV special to sing for them to come back. The bus then falls further into the ravine, landing in a bucket of ice cream as it's revealed the entire thing was a dream of a dream, even Miss Crabtree's plotline. Ordinarily, clip shows are used by networks and creators alike to recycle old animation and reduce costs. South Park's clip show episode, however, uses old episode scenes and then intentionally reanimates them for a gag, replacing the true ending to each episode's plotline to have everyone get ice cream, and as a result completely eliminating the possible financial benefit of a clip show. Of course, it's not as though South Park is an especially expensive show to produce, even if the technicalities behind recreating the stop-motion cutout style are more complex than many critics give them credit for. This results in them having extra budget for things like getting Henry Winkler to play a guest spot in this episode as, you guessed it, the monster who killed Kenny, or gave them ice cream depending on if it's a flashback. It's also not like South Park is not used to the technique used in this episode to fake flashback sequences, as the entire foundation of the show's animation style is effectively just recreating their original paper cutouts, as well as the various techniques used there. Earlier, blood splatters were just red marker that Matt and Trey drew on their backgrounds. Then, they had to find a computer-generated idea that looked like it was red marker. Crowd shots used to be challenging as they had to individually move each person, so most of the kids in South Park Elementary would sit perfectly still. But now they can be copy-pasted much more easily from earlier shots, which has wound up giving the character designers inspiration for many of the show's sidecast after their first appearances, such as the random geologist from the first season getting repurposed into Randy Marsh. Summer sucks. Mr. Garrison, upset about losing Mr. Hat, dismisses the kids for summer break only for the children to learn that fireworks have been banned in Colorado due to a kid in North Park losing his hand. Upon seeing the kids fail to find some other source of fun, Jimbo and Ned decide to go to Mexico to buy fireworks to transport back up and save Summer. Meanwhile, the mayor wants to hold a great fireworks celebration by purchasing the largest snake, the only still legal firework she can get, and having the elementary school orchestra play as it gets lit. Cartman tries to take swimming lessons only to refuse to swim as first graders are peeing in the pool. The day of the fireworks celebration occurs, and the snake keeps growing until it grows out of control and threatens the whole country. The state of emergency closes the pool, finally allowing Cartman to swim as Jimbo and Ned are broken out of jail, having been arrested for smuggling fireworks by the snake. They arrive back at South Park in time to give the explosives to Stan and Kyle, who blow up the base of the snake, showering the town in ash, which gives everyone the snow day they wanted. As Mr. Garrison is in therapy to cope with his missing puppet, Dr. Katz, yes, that one, implies that Mr. Hat is a way for the man to subconsciously let out his homosexual desires, an idea Garrison rejects to replace him with Mr. Twig. This episode is hard to describe succinctly as it has so many A, B, C, and so on plotlines. South Park in general is actually a very interestingly written show in this regard, something that a lot of older series, especially animated, cannot really claim. Plots are rarely a series of disconnected events that move the characters around, as is so often the case with series that have a comedic focus, but rather are a collapsing house of cards, where each event plays into the others, with the A-plot having less to do with runtime and more to do with the inciting incident. Cartman gets to swim because the snake closed the pool. Jimbo and Ned are broken out of jail by it. The kids have their coveted snow day when it explodes. The only disconnected plot is Mr. Garrison's loss of Mr. Hat, and even then, this is merely building towards a future plotline. Chef's Salty Chocolate Balls. Upon realizing their old location is no longer a quaint mountain town, but more like LA and overrun with people, Robert Redford takes the Sundance Film Festival to South Park, which is immediately overrun. The kids have to go to the festival to write a report on one of the movies there, so Stan and Wendy head out to watch gay cowboys eating pudding. But Kyle overhears Mr. Hankey crying and searches the sewers to ask what's wrong, learning that the lean diets of the Hollywood types are poisoning his ecosystem, and he cannot go to the surface outside of Christmas time to warn them. The boys try to tell the film-goers about this, but only end up with a film deal, with Cartman taking all the credit, though he only winds up with $3 to show for this. When Kyle tries to take Mr. Hankey to the surface, he gets killed by the dry summer air and has to be resuscitated by Chef's titular chocolate balls, which, after a failed speech, reinvigorates him to simply drown the whole film festival in a big wave of feces. The film-goers all flee, and the citizens of South Park are left with their crap-covered town. This is the third episode this season where the major antagonist is someone in the entertainment industry motivated by greed. After the trials of the first season, it's natural that Trey Parker and Matt Stone would start to air their grievances with the industry in their work. South Park has always been a show about their personal experiences, with characters effectively based on real-life people they knew, from Shelley based on Trey's real sister to Randy being designed after his father. Mr. Mackey speaks like his old school counselor. Even Stan and Kyle are just stand-ins for Trey and Matt, though they've later stated that they both feel closer to Eric Cartman. These grievances get aired towards film festivals in general and the type of person they attract, and it's worth pointing out the history behind this specific complaint. Matt and Trey once wanted their film Orgasmo to be aired at Sundance, only to have it rejected. So when Mr. Hankey gets on his soapbox and complains that movie festivals are supposed to be about getting lesser-known, small productions a chance, this is what he's referring to. Not to have a bunch of pretentious indie films take the spotlight, but to allow silly things like a superhero/porno parody to get some attention. Then again, something called Orgasmo likely does not have the same subjective merits that people are looking for, so perhaps we're also meant to look into the fact that, without cowboys eating pudding, we just have a town covered in feces. Chickenpox. The parents of South Park want to get their kids chickenpox while they're young and send Stan, Kyle, and Cartman to Kenny's house to catch it from him. While there, they question why the McCormick family has so little, while the Broflovskis have so much despite their fathers being friends as children. To repair this rift, Sheila convinces Stuart and Gerald to go fishing together, though this only results in the two fighting. When Gerald returns home to see that Kyle has written an assignment misinterpreting his justification for why some people have less, he realizes that he might have been in the wrong. Eventually, all the kids get chickenpox except for Kyle, who overhears his mother on the phone revealing she wanted her son to catch it. So they get their revenge by asking Chef for a woman who has herpes to infect their parents, only for Kyle to eventually collapse as he finally gets infected himself. They get taken to the hospital where the parents admit that they should have been more open about their intentions, and the episode ends with everyone laughing, except for Kenny, who died. This episode has multiple conflicts, all caused by people taking simple answers to complex problems. Gerald assumes that anybody who is poor has to be poor because society works better that way. Some people are supposed to have less, and that social and economic mobility will ruin society. Rather than thinking that poverty is expensive and that he may have had things a little better than his old friend, he takes a reductive view of the issue. Stuart likewise takes a simple solution to his problems. He and Gerald have similar childhoods, but he didn't work nearly as hard. As a result, he and his old friend went their separate ways as their class differences kept them apart. But instead of doing some introspection and trying to, at the very least, make sure Kenny has better circumstances than he did, he attributes all of Gerald's success to the fact that he's Jewish. The kids likewise are never taught the more complicated truth behind why their parents want them to get chickenpox from each other. Since it's not explained how the disease is safer for children to get, so it's out of the way sooner, they collectively come to a quick conclusion that their parents are just mean. Stan takes the suffering he sees himself going through, mostly spurred on by being in a hospital bed next to Shelley, and cannot imagine it happening for a good reason. Cartman is bathing in lotion to soothe his itching and comes to the same conclusion based on a preconceived notion of disliking his mother. And while the parents are to blame for never taking the time to explain their thought process to the kids, it's also a much harder task to convince somebody of an uncomfortable and complicated truth than a simple lie. So most people would take the easy way out of that as well. Roger Ebert should lay off the fatty foods. South Park Elementary is visiting the planetarium for a school trip, mildly disturbed by the behavior of the volunteers there, while Cartman is more interested in auditioning for a Cheesy Poops commercial. They wind up bringing home an additional child whose panic attack gets him taken to the nurse's office, where Mr. Mackey does a Vulcan mind meld to learn what's going on. The kids, however, are very interested in going back to the planetarium, despite not knowing why. Though the truth is that Dr. Adams, the director, is using the stars to mind control people. Eventually, Stan realizes that they hate volunteering and that something must be wrong, so they sneak into the booth to test the equipment on Kenny, blowing him up in the process. Stan and Kyle report this to Officer Barbrady, and they meet with Mr. Maggie and Nurse Gollum to shut things down, only to be held up by the mind-controlled cop and forced to get hypnotized. Meanwhile, Cartman's Cheesy Poops commercial audition was a success, mostly because every other candidate volunteered at the planetarium. Though he's annoyed that no one watched his commercial, so Cartman angrily smashes the projector, accidentally saving the day. Clubhouses. Wendy tries to hook Kyle and Bebe up by getting them to play Truth or Dare in Stan's clubhouse, but Stan does not have a clubhouse, so he tries to recruit Randy into helping him build one. But Randy is distracted by Sharon asking him to get her wedding ring out of the garbage disposal, resulting in an argument that results in them separating. Meanwhile, Cartman and Kenny try to make their own clubhouse to compete with Stan and Kyle's, though Kenny does most of the construction, including the procurement of women to populate it. These teenagers wind up inviting more and more people over until they overrun Cartman's clubhouse and crush Kenny in a mosh pit. Stan and Kyle eventually finish their clubhouse, inviting Bebe and Wendy over and trying to use some of Chef's advice on how to play the game. This results in Kyle running away when he has to kiss Bebe, who eventually breaks up with him despite Kyle not realizing they were ever dating. Stan is upset that his mother has moved on to date a man named Roy, who keeps yelling at Stan to do chores as punishment for not opening up. But Stan hears from TV to simply kill your stepdad if you don't like him, and he sets a trap for Roy that winds up getting his parents back together in the process. When Trey Parker and Matt Stone set out to create South Park, one of the key features they wanted to focus on was a direct response to the way children were typically portrayed on TV at the time. Specifically that kids were viewed as kind and caring, and that growing older is what makes children into bad adults. They countered this by showing the kids the way they were, as crude and hostile as anyone might be, arguing that adulthood was when you finally understood to suppress your hostility and to act kinder to people instead of basing your behavior off of instinct. And this episode posits why children tend to be worse people than the adults in their lives, a lack of experience in separating fact from fiction. Stan gets the idea from a TV show to kill his stepfather. The boys constantly reference pop culture in their day-to-day lives and seem to think the world works the way it's portrayed to work in fiction. This is why the end of the episode is intentionally bizarre. Two divorced people getting back together as a man is hanging upside down outside the window. Like repairing a fractured marriage is as easy as it is in old movies. Kids are cruel because TV rewards and promotes cruelty. Adults are nicer because they've learned not to trust everything they see or hear. At least in theory. Cow Days. A couple named Tom and Mary wins a trip to the South Park Cow Days Rodeo and Carnival in a game show, and they try to make the best of it as they watch the unveiling of a huge cow clock. But this cow clock is stolen by hypnotized cows, who begin to worship it. Tom and Mary are accused of stealing the statue and thrown in jail, but the real culprit is discovered, and they shut down the cow cult, with the cows responding to this by jumping off a cliff. Meanwhile, Stan and the others are trying to win Terrance and Phillip dolls in a ball-throwing game, but as the game is rigged, they fail to make any headway, made worse when they run out of money because Cartman kept spending it. So they force Cartman to participate in the bull riding event to win $5,000 so they can get more attempts, but his training for this winds up with Cartman getting a head injury and thinking that he's a Vietnamese prostitute named Ming Lee. Cartman winds up winning the event and even setting a record despite the bull going mad and goring Kenny. The kids take his winnings back to the ball-throwing game, only to simply trade the money for dolls and learn that they were knockoffs. They call shenanigans, and a riot ensues, with the carnies being arrested and thrown into jail, only where Officer Barbrady sees that Tom and Mary starved to death. While South Park, the town, is meant to be a satirical representation of the flyover parts of America, even as early as the second season, it's being portrayed as far more extreme than that, to the point that comedy can be made by taking a normal couple and dropping them into the middle of a large gathering. The people of South Park are quick to anger and quick to turn a declaration of shenanigans into a massive broom fight, while the normal folks are only sticking with it as they're far more optimistic than is healthy, waiting around to see the best in the people and their traditions, only for the best of them to never show up. Chef Aid. Chef is sued for pointing out to a record company that a recent hit song is plagiarized from something he wrote decades ago. Gerald Broflovsky defends him, but the record label hires Johnny Cochran to defend them, who uses the Chewbacca defense, arguing about irrelevant nonsense to make his case, and Chef is ordered to pay $2 million or go to jail. While trying to cheer Chef up, the kids all see his memoirs of his time cooking for celebrities, and they get the idea to sell candy bars to these celebrities to raise money for his legal fees, not to pay back the record label, but to hire Cochran to sue them back, though they come up short even when they combine their earnings with the money Chef raised sleeping with the woman of South Park. But as Chef is being arrested, the kids decide to put on Chef Aid, a concert to raise more money. The celebrities they contacted before all show up, putting on a concert that is massively successful, with Ozzy Osbourne biting Kenny's head off. until the label CEO shows up and saws through the stage, ending the concert. But Johnny, seeing the support for Chef, decides to do the case free of charge. Meanwhile, Mr. Twig keeps getting assaulted, and Mr. Garrison learns that the culprit is Mr. Hat. After throwing Mr. Hat out and yelling at him, Garrison gets arrested, only for Mr. Hat to break him and Chef out of jail just in time for the concert. Isaac Hayes is better known for his work co-writing Soul Man and the theme for Shaft, with his notoriety such that when Trey Parker and Matt Stone first came up with the character of Chef, they wanted Isaac Hayes to voice him from the beginning. Sometimes his lines would be recorded over the phone, but occasionally, if one of the showrunners was nearby, they would arrive in person to have him do his lines that way. This former experience is what was most common when getting other celebrities on the show, and Matt and Trey never had a shortage of people wanting to appear after the success of the initial run. It was to the point that they often wound up feeling like jerks after some of their more mean-spirited portrayals were found funny, and after they started running into people like Bob Saget or Sally Struthers, they started trying to reaffirm that the celebrities they portrayed were more often than not completely randomly selected, meant to satirize people's obsession with celebrities rather than the celebrity themselves. They followed through on this idea by ensuring that the celebrities they did include never had important roles playing as themselves, relegated instead to barking like a dog or meowing in a booth for 15 minutes. Spookyfish. Presented in Spooky Vision, meaning there are pictures of Barbra Streisand in frame. Sharon Marsh is visited by her Aunt Flo, a literal aunt, and she gives Stan a goldfish as a present. But Stan is unnerved by this goldfish, with his fears becoming validated when dead bodies start to appear in his bedroom. Sharon buries these bodies in the backyard, and even kidnaps Officer Barbrady when he arrives to investigate. Meanwhile, Cartman, now with a Star Trek Mirror Universe goatee, has been acting strange, giving supply to Kenny's family during a storm and singing songs about how much he loves carving pumpkins with his friends. They ask Chef about what's going on and learn that there is a portal to a mirror universe opening up, tracking it down to the Indian Burial Ground pet store. Mirror Cartman convinces the store owner to take the fish back, but Mirror Stan and Kyle come in, searching for their universe's Cartman, and they release all of the killer animals, who then attack the pumpkin carving contest as the Mirror and Canon universe kids face off. Both Cartmans get into a fight, tearing off the goatee, and the Canon Cartman pretends to be a nice guy, so they shoot the wrong one. A Halloween episode that parodies Halloween episodes, although in South Park almost anything that it portrays will be portrayed in parody, so that practically goes without saying. This is accomplished more thoroughly by intentionally including faux crude effects that, ironically, would not be affordances made in animation. Things like the Mirror Cartman always appearing next to a line meant to denote a poorly done split-screen effect, or the way that the pet store being built on an Indian burial ground was done because the store owner was drunk, down to Aunt Flo having a shimmering appearance, explained as Parkinson's disease, or a killer fish who's able to commit murders without leaving its fishbowl. Merry Christmas, Charlie Manson. Stan's parents refuse to let him go to Cartman's family's house in Nebraska, so he sneaks out and goes anyway. After a long car trip, they arrive at a house full of people who are just like Cartman, including Howard Cartman via satellite from prison, who later breaks out to hide in their basement alongside another escaped convict, Charlie Manson. The boys learn that Mr. Hankey is going to be at the Nebraska Mall, and as none of Cartman's family want to drive them there, Charlie takes them. But Kyle learns that the Mr. Hankey at the mall is a fake, which starts the riot, one that a now reformed Charlie Manson drives them away from. He was reformed watching the Mr. Hankey Christmas special. They arrive back at the Cartman household where they get involved in a police standoff, including Stan's family. Charlie and Howard try to escape out the back window, and Stan tries to go with them so he won't get in trouble. But Charlie convinces Stan to go back to his family, as the holiday season is about being happy with those you love. He also decides to give himself up, and after the police shoot the surrendering Kenny, goes back to jail where the Cartman family sings the inmates a Christmas song. After his film debut in an earlier episode, Mr. Hankey is now a national icon, with merchandise and fake appearances throughout the country. And while this is presented as a statement on the oversaturation of holiday markets sabotaging any real meaning the season could have, it doubles as a representation of South Park's merchandising as well. In their deal with the network, Trey and Matt got very little control over merchandising of their work, and so there were tons of products made based on the show and its setting, never run by either of them. Mr. Hankey is an integral part of Kyle's childhood, and seeing as he is a stand-in for the show's creators and the events are based on their childhoods, he finds it annoying that a part of his memories of being young are now being marketed and sold in mass quantities. Trey and Matt have stated that walking into stores and seeing South Park merchandise lining the walls is akin to seeing a bunch of people wandering around your childhood bedroom and taking things off of the shelves. And then, in an especially ironic twist, the episode ends with a moral told by a serial killer about the true meaning of the holidays, as he ends up reformed by watching, of course, a commercialized holiday product. Gnomes. As the school board is questioning whether Mr. Garrison is competent at his job, the kids are required to write a report on a current event in South Park, and the main four are paired with Tweek, a hyperactive student whose parents run a coffee shop. The kids stay up all night after drinking his father's coffee, and he gives them a pre-written report on the Harbucks takeover of his small business. This report convinces the school board to take the case to the mayor, who then takes the case to the people, telling the boys they now need to write a speech prior to a referendum vote. Since they didn't write their first paper, they have to stay up all night figuring out what to do when the Underpants Gnomes visit Tweek's bedroom to steal his underpants. When they explain their situation to the Gnomes offer to explain business to them, despite Kenny getting crushed in a minecart accident. The next day, the boys go up to the surface and give their speech on why big business is actually good, and Tweek's mother chimes in by saying that they never should have used the kids as political pawns. Harbucks Coffee remains open, and Tweek's father is offered a job running the store as the Underpants Gnomes continue to steal underpants. And just because a corporation is big doesn't mean that it's evil by default. Just because a company is family-run doesn't mean that it's very good either. That said, it's not as though you really get big in the first place without being at least a little bit evil. After all, if you're not using underhanded tactics, someone else will. Basic economic laws state that when two businesses are competing, the bigger one will win due to economy of scale, reducing operating costs. Harbucks can make better coffee than a local brewer, and what's worse, they can do it cheaper if they're willing to operate at a loss for a while. It's the typical MO of the Harbucks equivalents of the world, to first use superior size to run competition out of the market, or collect underpants. Then once the smaller businesses are run out of town, they cut corners and raise prices until the Mr. Tweeks of the world wind up ousted, and they shut down the excess stores. They then downsize until all the benefits of the company being larger are done away with, and the local coffee monopoly is finally theirs. And then stage 3 is profit. One can imagine the Underpants Gnomes selling the underpants back to the townspeople at an inflated cost once they grow desperate enough to tolerate the price gouging. Then again, maybe you should not get economic advice from magical underpants-stealing gnomes or a show about farting 9-year-olds. Prehistoric Ice Man. While playing Crocodile Hunter in the mountains, Cartman pushes Kyle down a hole. They lower Stan in with him, where they discover a man frozen in the cave, pulling him out and taking him to town, where Dr. Mephisto thaws him for research. This man is revealed to have been frozen for over 32 months, coming from the distant past of 1996. And a few government men come over to try and make the study more profitable by putting the Iceman, Larry, on display. Meanwhile, Stan and Kyle fight over who it was who found the man and thus who gets to name him, getting into a fight and declaring that Cartman is now their real best friend. They both get the idea to let Larry go free, and after he fails to adapt to life in the future as his wife has remarried, they plan to send him to a place frozen in time, Iowa. But Mephisto and the government have hired Steve Irwin to track them down, with Cartman tailing them, and as they chase down the train, eventually fighting it out until it crashes into a helicopter that Larry then steals. As he flies into the sunset, Stan and Kyle realize that Cartman is kind of annoying, and they don't want to be his best friend. This episode plays with the idea of a man being from out of time, arguing that the difference of merely 3 years is enough to make society seem bizarre and too different to cope with for someone from as early as the year before South Park began to air. It isn't so much played as a tongue-in-cheek way of toying with the idea of a caveman adapting to the future, as it is a way of placing these concepts into a new context that allows the rest of Larry's life to be ignored. He's viewed as being unable to adapt to the world, explaining all his misery, when we also see that people assume they can't communicate, and that his wife had been cheating on him for at least a decade before he was ever frozen. And of course, he looks at the actions of Stan and Kyle instead of the context of them, thanking the boys for putting aside their differences and postponing their fight to get him safely into the past of Des Moines, and ignoring that they only stopped because the desired end result of being friends with Cartman was less desirable than letting the other guy take credit for naming the caveman. Rainforest Schmainforest. A traveling choir visits South Park Elementary, and the boys are sent on their trip to the rainforest as punishment for talking during the presentation. The boys are upset about this, except for Kenny, who has a crush on one of the girls in the choir. But the choir teacher, Miss Stevens, is confident she can change their minds on the rainforest during their trip to Costa Rica. On a tour of the rainforest, their guide is eaten by a snake, leaving them lost and wandering in circles for days as the president worries about whether they will make it to the concert in time. They stumble into a military camp and later are assaulted by a tribe before Miss Stevens finally acknowledges that she hates the rainforest, just in time for Cartman, who'd wandered off on his own, to arrive with construction equipment to destroy the rainforest and save them. In the end, they put on a presentation for the activists about how much they hate the rainforest and don't care whether or not it's bulldozed. Miss Stevens was played by Jennifer Aniston with the single condition that her character survive the episode and she gets to swear a lot, both conditions that were met in the episode's script. The episode's plot was inspired by a real trip Trey Parker took to the rainforest as part of a Save the Rainforest group at the urging of Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers. While there, he had a terrible time, with many of Cartman's lines being directly pulled from his experiences there, effectively mirroring the experience of Miss Stevens, where a wealthy white person visited the rainforest, had a bad time, and then decided that they no longer cared about its condition since only the fun parts of the world need to be conserved. But it's not as though this limited view of the environment is the full extent of their politics, though. We see a brief glimpse at why the rainforest is being bulldozed in the first place, largely corruption from the local government, political instability in the area being preserved, and of course, the fact that ecology is not good for short-term profits. So weighing all of these issues with the general good that the rainforest does just by existing against the counterpoint, the jungle is gross and sometimes activists are annoying. We see, at least to the showrunners, these are about equal. Spontaneous combustion. The boys have overheard troubles with Gerald's sex life and are searching for a direction to fix things, only for Kenny to spontaneously combust. While at his funeral, the priest offers to have them portray the Stations of the Cross, where they misheard resurrection and think that's what Kyle's dad needs. Cartman volunteers to play the role of Jesus and is placed on a cross, where he's then left to die. Meanwhile, Randy is given the task of discovering the root cause of these combustions when he deduces it's because people are holding in their farts. He is celebrated as a hero for saving lives, only for the weather to suddenly turn much warmer as Dr. Mephisto concludes that the localized global warming is caused by people farting too much. Randy is now an outcast overnight as people throw rocks at him, but after a motivational speech borrowed from the Wrath of Khan, he's motivated to put his research before his popularity and manages to find a middle ground for healthy farting. This episode's plot is started and ended by Randy's ego, with the man only getting involved in a scientific pursuit so he can feel good about himself as the townspeople treat him like a hero. His motives are less about actually solving the spontaneous combustion problem, and thus, when a new problem occurs, he acts as though it's beneath him, because he already has what he wants, fame and recognition. But because people's farts are causing the next issue, that fame is now taken away. His original motivation for fixing problems was for fame, and he no longer has that. It's not until he sheds his ego and starts to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do that anything actually gets solved. When Randy fixes global warming, he does so fully expecting people to throw rocks at him for daring to suggest that they changed their lifestyle. Succubus. Cartman gets his pupils dilated at the optometrist and wants to ask Chef what to do about the fact that he will soon need glasses, only for the boys to discover that Chef quit his job. They ask him about this, and he reveals that he met a woman named Veronica, who has replaced his soulful singing with covers of The Morning After, and turned him away from his life of sleeping around. With nowhere to turn to, they ask Mr. Garrison for advice, and he tells them that Veronica is a succubus, sent to steal the life force from men. They try to tell Chef about this, but get caught up listening to stories about the Loch Ness Monster instead, abandoning a direct approach to instead search for another way. They find out they can banish a succubus by singing her magic song backwards, and they crash the wedding vows to sing After Morning the at her. Though as Cartman has been blinded by the corrective eye surgery, he can't see how to fix the jammed tape, and Veronica kills Kenny. But after a distraction by Chef's mother, they are able to finish the song, banishing the succubus back to hell and bringing everything back to normal. As the second season had a lot of bashing critics and Hollywood types for their lack of appreciation for movies like Orgasmo and Basketball, this episode then rolls back some of the rhetoric around those earlier failures by including a character like Mr. Derp, who makes a one-time appearance to make fun of the lowbrow comedy that Trey and Matt once peddled. It's not as though South Park was much better. In fact, the earlier seasons were really just the two men seeing what they could get away with. They only agreed to star in a movie because they assumed South Park would never get renewed. But when it did, they found themselves waking up in the morning, shooting the movie all day, and then staying up till 3 a.m. writing and animating South Park. Part of the show's famously quick creation can be attributed to habits formed during that crunch time. Season 3 was not much better in this regard, as South Park was now also getting a movie of its own, meaning that once again, the showrunners found themselves working on normal episodes and the movie, with little time to spare between anything. As a result, this early run of Season 3 is usually considered the least favorite part of South Park by Matt and Trey, due to how frequently they had to release a product that was just good enough instead of good. Jakovasaurus. While camping in the woods, Cartman discovers a duck-like species and the boys chase it to Jimbo's house, interrupting their search for Ned's missing voice box to find it in one of their traps. Cartman takes it to the mayor for a reward, and soon this Jakovasaurus Joom is found a mate when the only male Jakovasaur, named Jakoff, asks Cartman for help. The Department of the Interior helps them to reproduce artificially by recruiting Dr. Mephisto, and soon, Joom gives birth to a whole litter of Jakovasaurs, who start to populate South Park Elementary, interrupting the lessons and annoying the citizens. They try to get rid of the new species, but Cartman pleads with Jakoff to stay, and the Department of the Interior men give up and deputize Cartman to make it his problem. So Mayor McDaniels works with the boys to distract Cartman while they rig a game show to trick the whole species into getting on a plane to France, where the people love their duck-like antics. Joom is most obviously based on Jar Jar Binks, a character that Matt and Trey said they were confident would be hated from the trailers alone. That when a character is so overtly implemented for cheap comedy, it's sure to be hated if that comedy doesn't really do anything but get on people's nerves. Naturally, Cartman, the former most annoying South Park resident, would be the one to find Jakoff to be cool, as he's going to be compared to a much lower standard than before. And it's not as though the showrunners could have been going for anything else, considering that the Jakovasauruses have only ever made one other non-canon appearance as enemies in a spin-off video game. Tweek vs. Craig. During shop class, the boys start discussing which among them is the biggest troublemaker, which winds up as a discussion on who would win in a fight between Tweek and Craig. They try to get the boys to fight each other, but neither one is especially interested, despite all the insults they pretend are being slung. Even after they meet up to fight, neither boy actually knows how to, so they are taken to separate places for training, Tweek learning how to box by kicking Ned in the balls, and Craig learning sumo by fighting Cartman's ass. Kenny is the only boy in the home economics class, learning how to ask his future husband for more money when the teacher forcibly transfers him into shop class, led by Mr. Adler, who is constantly reminiscing about his dead, live-action wife. These memories, and running out of nicotine gum, cause him to lay down on an active table saw, only for this to be interrupted by Tweek and Craig's fight bursting through the door, pushing Kenny into a pile of rusty nails. When Mr. Adler pulls Kenny out of the nails, he suddenly sees the ghosts of everyone he knows who's ever died, and they tell him not to get so hung up on goodbyes. In the end, Craig and Tweek are hospitalized and the rest of the school visits, so they can egg on the fight even more. Tweek and Craig have no actual issue with one another through the entire episode and are only ever convinced to fight as a result of other people trying to force them to do so with verbal manipulation. This mostly comes about as negative reinforcement. If you don't fight, you are a wuss. If you don't fight, you're not a real man. This sort of gendered bullying is also used to do things like push Kenny away from home ec and towards shop, a class he really doesn't want to take as he knows better than for a death-prone student to be around power tools. And when Tweek and Craig train for their fight, they are prodded onward by learning about how boxing is a manly sport, and that it's tough and cool to learn to beat people up. Possibly by accident, this episode shows the ways in which authority figures can push kids towards certain behaviors. Kenny was actually thriving in home ec and seemed to enjoy the classwork and being surrounded constantly by women. Early in the episode, we even saw that Wendy wanted to be in shop but was not allowed to take it, forced instead to sit in a classroom and learn how to be a housewife. And this isn't an episode where the A-plot is all about two boys with no conflict being pushed to hate each other through peer pressure alone. Sexual harassment panda. After a string of sexual harassment cases, the sexual harassment panda is brought into South Park Elementary to teach kids about sexual harassment. After this lesson, Cartman sues Stan for a crude comment directed at him, and Kyle's dad represents him, with Cartman getting half of Stan's stuff. But after realizing the potential to make money off of frivolous lawsuits, Gerald encourages Cartman to sue the school for allowing these cases to occur, and then more and more students sue each other, with the school paying out in each case, making Gerald and Kyle rich on commission. Eventually, the school loses all its money, so the kids go to the island of misfit mascots to get Sexual Harassment Panda back after he was fired during the budget cuts, and later run out of town by angry rednecks. They convince the panda to rebrand as the Frivolous Lawsuit Panda, and he convinces everyone not to sue each other, with Gerald immediately siding with him so as to protect himself. It's important whenever you create a new rule or begin changing enforcement of another one to consider the most bad faith possible interpretation of that rule change, to consider how a change to that rule or system can possibly be used to hurt people it was never meant to, or to protect bad faith actors hiding behind the rule as a shield they can then use to bash others over the head while claiming they're the real victim. What would Eric Cartman do? Of course, in real life, if an 8-year-old were sued for calling someone butt liquor, any judge with a bit of sense would dismiss the case, and any lawyer who passed the bar would know better than to even entertain the idea. But this is South Park, and it's a town of exaggerations of real life, where bad faith interpretations are given the same weight as the honest ones. But bad faith cuts both ways. Just as much as someone can take advantage of a frivolous lawsuit to sue people for an insult, the other end of this episode's messaging about not making these lawsuits in the first place could also be used as a defense mechanism, something we immediately see Gerald do as soon as it looks like the town is about to turn on him. Naturally, anyone who has wronged another person will claim that the retaliation is disproportionate, if retaliation can exist at all, or still as a person using the threat of claiming this when they know they've done wrong. That is to say, an abuser will claim that they're the victim when the person they abused tries to speak up. Cat Orgy. Miss Cartman is going to a meteor shower party and leaves Cartman alone with his new babysitter, Shelley. She is tough on him, forcing him to take care of everything while she has her new boyfriend over. This new boyfriend, Skylar, is 22 years old and is mostly interested in whether Shelley, who is 12, will put out. Cartman plans on getting a picture of them together to send to his mom, attaching it to the collar of Mr. Kitty and having the cat go out to warn her. But as Mr. Kitty is in heat, she simply goes back to the front door to keep wrecking up the place. Cartman then tries to record audio of Skylar being over, only to instead catch him breaking up with Shelley because she won't have sex with him. Seeing her crying on the couch, Cartman and Shelley then plan to sneak into his house using Cartman's dolls as a distraction so they can smash up his guitar, bonding over their hatred of the pedophile on their way home, only to see that Mr. Kitty has invited over several other cats for a catnip-fueled orgy, and they have trashed the place. Before they can start cleaning up, Skylar returns for revenge, only for Cartman to throw catnip at his face, where he is then assaulted by the horny cats. Trey and Matt had just finished creating the movie, which will be covered separately at the end of this season's retrospective, and still had 3 episodes they had to deliver on. As a way to expedite the writing process, they came up with an idea to have each of these 3 episodes focus on a different member of the main cast, having the stories take place concurrently to justify this. As a result, the characters are able to shine in more of a vacuum, seeing less of their interactions with each other, and more of what motivates them when they're not around their friends. The opening scene of this episode, as well as Cartman's behavior for the rest of it, is based on the movie Wild Wild West, which came out on the same weekend as the South Park movie, something Trey and Matt were frustrated with as not only did that movie outperform theirs, but their movie helped it out a ton, as kids would buy tickets to see Will Smith, and then sneak into the theater playing the rated R South Park instead, making the Hollywood hype train even bigger. Two guys naked in a hot tub. Stan laments being dragged to a meteor shower party with his parents as he ends up, predictably, locked in the basement with the nerdy kids as the adults have fun upstairs. These nerdy kids try to pressure Stan into dressing in women's clothing and playing Charlie's Angels with them, so he gives them the mission to find a way out of the basement, eventually making their way to the party and watching TV at Mr. Mackey's house. At this party, Gerald and Randy find a hot tub and get inside, talking about all the experimentation they want to do, but can't because they have families. This conversation then turns towards masturbating in front of each other in the hot tub, which weighs on Randy later as he starts to snap at his friend when he thinks he's told everyone. Eventually they begin to argue, with Randy shouting what happened between them out loud, only for every other guy at the party to admit that he has done the same thing before resuming life as normal. Outside the party, the ATF has arrived on the assumption that the partygoers are members of a religious cult preparing for a mass suicide, and they try to stop the party by shooting at anyone who goes outside. Stan and the others notice this and make a plan for each boy to contribute to, with the tape of the party getting sent to the reporter outside to prove that they were innocent. Once this tape gets out, the ATF pretends it was a training exercise and they quickly leave, as Stan says the nerdy kids are all right. At least until Kyle shows up and he renounces them immediately. Part 2 of the Meteor Shower trilogy and the birth of Butters. He had appeared in a few background roles leading up to this episode, but had a different voice in each appearance, and never had anything resembling a consistent personality, mostly serving as one of the seat filler students to make crowd shots look more like a crowd. This is the episode where the showrunners finally figured out what they wanted to do with him, mostly replacing Pip. Pip was supposed to be the unpopular character in-universe, but wound up being disliked outside of the show itself as well. Butters replaced him, but with a little bit less of a British stereotype and a little bit more naivety and a genuine personality, something missing from the show up to this point. Butters is not just the name of the Melvin in this episode, but also the name of the animation director of South Park, who also inspired the speech patterns of the character. This is not the first time an impression that Matt and Trey would entertain themselves with became a character on the show, but it is one of the few that managed to stick so thoroughly. Jubilee. Kyle is sent to Jubilee, an annual gathering, by his parents who bring Kenny along as he has nowhere else to go. As the Profslovskys arrive at the camp, Ike is separated out to be with the Squirts, whose supervisor is unhappy about watching little kids, so he sets out to hunt a bear instead, with the kids getting kidnapped by the bear one by one. Meanwhile, the Jubilee activities start with crafts and chanting around a fire, only for Moses, who takes the form of the Master Control program from Tron, to be summoned, pleased by their soap sculptures while demanding the Squirt's macaroni art, until he notices that Kenny is not Jewish and he gets ousted. Kenny then watches as the anti-Semitic sect's leader, recently kicked out for suggesting they worship Haman instead of Moses, traps Moses inside of a conch shell and locks the others in a cabin at gunpoint. Kenny then tries to find help, failing to flag down the ATF and getting captured by the bear, who takes him to the Squirts, simply dragged away to attend a bear cub's birthday party. Kenny explains the situation, and the Squirts and bears attack the camp, stopping Haman's summoning by stealing the conch and liberating Moses by smashing it into Kenny's head. The Jewish leaders honor Kenny for sacrificing himself to save them, even after they kicked him out, by making those little paper shaker things with glitter on the outside. Matt and Trey had only one episode to finish before they got to leave for a mid-season vacation, one they were both eagerly ready for, but as they had spent several long nights working on not just the show, but the movie. In their own words, they were crawling on the floor to try to finish it as they lacked the energy to do anything else. Normally, South Park episodes are written start to end instead of getting the beginning and ending first, and filling in the gaps as necessary. This meant that they were completely wiped out by the time they had to figure out how to end the schism of Judaism, and so the magic conch being broken and Moses demanding handicrafts as the Bear Cub birthday party saves the day is what audiences got. It wasn't an ending that Matt and Trey were especially proud of at first, but upon seeing the positive reception and the general direction the show went following this point, it was clear that their reliance on traditional screenwriting techniques would get them nowhere. If they simply did something weird and stupid, they could still be successful. Moses was weird in this episode, and people still liked him, so there was no longer any pressure to preserve a sense of, well, sense in the show. South Park is a show that's nothing like what else is on television, and leaning further into this unique quality in the upcoming seasons is what has given South Park so much of its longevity and continued popularity. Corn's groovy pirate ghost mystery. The whole town is preparing for a Halloween bash at the South Park docks, except for Cartman, who is preparing for Christmas. But when some 5th graders scare the boys, they make a plan to get back at them by digging up Kyle's dead grandma. They leave her body near the docks for later, where she is eaten by a dog, and as they're investigating this mystery, they find the band Corn, recently run off the road by ghost pirates. At a town meeting where people are discussing the missing defiled corpse, the pirate ghosts arrive and start to shoot their cannon at the gathered people, something they blame Corn for, as they believe their music is devil worship. Back at the docks, Corn has teamed up with the kids to hunt for the ghost pirates themselves, using Cartman's inflatable Antonio Banderas as bait, only to accidentally catch themselves in time for an angry mob of townspeople to arrive. But then their alien bird mascot, Niblet, releases a trapdoor revealing the culprit was Father Maxi, trying to scare people out of celebrating Halloween. The stray dog vomits up Kyle's grandma, and Wendy wins the costume contest with her Chewbacca mask. A Halloween special with ghosts, unburied bodies, and pirates, as well as the natural predator of all of these things, a gang of Hanna-Barbera-like characters with a talking animal mascot. What starts out as a simple parody of old cartoons and their general progression winds up being combined with the South Park staple of rapid conflict escalation, then brought down by a Scooby-Doo ending. We go from the boys trying to come up with a way to scare some older kids, to digging up a corpse, to pirates killing townsfolk as they retaliate with the lynch mob, before finally landing not on an even more absurd note, but with the culprit getting revealed as Father Maxi, using the age-old fear that all new things are actually devil worship. This is even mocked alongside absurdities like the ghosts being made of cotton swabs and their moans being a piece of cheese. Chinpokomon. Chinpokomon, literally small penis monster, is the newest craze sweeping South Park, and every kid demands one, except for Kyle, who is a bit behind on his trends. As the kids obsess more and more over these Chinpokomon, the adults struggle to see what is so interesting about a show that's just a bunch of advertisements that give kids, like Kenny, seizures. They try to have the kids move on to a new trend but cannot find anything more interesting than Chinpokomon. They try confronting the Japanese themselves about the anti-American messages hidden in the show, but are placated with assurances that Americans have large penises. Eventually, a Chinpokomon camp happens in South Park where the kids are told to fly planes to take Pearl Harbor, and they line up to fight against America. And then Sharon Marsh gets a better idea. The adults start buying Chinpokomon and talking about how great they are, convincing the kids to stop obsessing as it is no longer cool. All except for Kyle, who's a bit behind on his trends, only convinced not to go along with it out of peer pressure. This episode raises two conflicting points about trend chasing, the first being the more obvious one, about the fact that trends are temporary, and chasing them is something you'll spend your whole life doing, as no amount of purchasing will ever have you up to date on whatever it is that everyone else is doing. The other immediately supersedes that trend chasing is just another aspect of fitting in, and that actively trying not to fit in will usually result in you getting exactly what you wanted, ostracized socially. Kyle says that he needs the latest Chinpokomon, whatever, not because he wants to do what the other kids are doing, but because he wants to know what they know and how to fit in. It's not as though he is chasing acceptance, he just doesn't want to stand out negatively at all. And he keeps up with this lesson in the end of the episode, now convinced he ought to stop chasing trends and should just stick to one thing. That thing happens to be attacking Pearl Harbor as revenge for the Japanese, and it's following trends not to do that once again that saves the day. Even the parents struggle to figure out if their kids ought to chase after trends, watching Chinpokomon themselves and being unable to figure out if it was a positive or negative role model to look up to. Sure, it was heavily over-commercialized, but then again, what children's show is not? Hooked on monkey phonics. Cartman gets a trained monkey to help prepare him for the upcoming spelling bee, but still loses to two homeschooled kids, Mark and Rebecca Cotswold. Kyle develops a crush on Rebecca and tries to woo her, something that adds to the concerns of their parents as Mark is intrigued by the behavior of the other kids at the spelling bee and wants to attend public school. They relent and let him go, only for Mark to get taped to a bench at recess for being too smart, though this does not deter him from coming back. Cartman, having just learned about homeschooling, decides to try it out by staying at home and eating junk food while his phonics monkey mauls Kenny. Meanwhile, Kyle manages to convince Rebecca to go to the school dance with him after introducing her to kissing, only for her to rapidly become extremely promiscuous. When Mark sees how his sister has changed after kissing Kyle, he gets angry and starts to beat the guy up, which then wins over the students of South Park, who now deem him cool enough to hang out with, as the adults decide that Mr. Cotswold is nerdy and they duct tape him to the flagpole. This episode posits that the true reason kids should be sent to public schools has far less to do with the quality of education and more to do with the ability to learn basic social interactions. Even if new parents think they can do a better job raising their kids than a public school teacher, the problem will be teaching your kids how to interact with their peers for hours at a time rather than a handful of disconnected, pre-arranged playdates. Because as adults, these kids will have to plan these events themselves, and they're going to have to learn how to get along with people who are not like them. It's not like chemistry and physics are things that everyone has to know, but understanding the scientific method makes you more likely to know when pseudoscience is being peddled nearby. You might not need to study math to go far in life, but you will need to learn how to study something, and the better you understand history and English, the less likely you are to fall for bad politics and fake news or sensationalism. And then, of course, you also need to learn to make your own mistakes when dealing with other people and then attempting to be with them. Mark is corrupted by the students of South Park Elementary as he starts to pick fights and curse people out through the end of the episode, both things that make him accepted enough that no one else picks on him. Rebecca did not learn this lesson the easy way, and instead learned it the hard way. Her parents tried to make her good by refusing to teach her about the concept of bad, meaning that her very first exposure to kissing boys in typical South Park fashion has turned her entirely bad. Starvin Marvin in space. A Marklar ship crashes on Marklar, and Starvin Marklar discovers it, taking it for a Marklar around the Earth as the American Marklar tries to stop him to obtain the Marklar on board. They head to South Park for a Marklar session on the boys to demand the Marklar of their friend, and Marklar eventually cracks and tells them what they need to know. They then head to Marklar to threaten his Marklar with theft, only for Marklar to return with news that the Marklar have allowed the Marklar people to live on their Marklar, without any of the annoying Marklars trying to convert them to Marklar. They make a Marklar to sneak the Marklar aboard and fly away, though Marklar is left behind and encased in Marklar as a gift to Sally Struthers, in exchange for a Marklar to chase them down. This Marklar joins in the Marklar against the Marklar transporting the Marklar as a Marklar through a wormhole. But the Marklar appealed to Sally Struthers' decency, and she agrees to Marklar the others, who then safely land on Marklar. The Marklar are confused about whether their Marklar is being followed, but Marklar convinces the Marklar to allow the Marklar to live there without Marklar. In the end, they return to Marklar, finally putting this stupid bit to rest. The Red Badge of Gayness. The town of South Park is reenacting the Civil War, which mostly consists of getting drunk on s'more-flavored schnapps and pretending to fall down. But Cartman has made a bet on the outcome of the war with Stan and Kyle, with the loser having to be the winner's slave, so he sneaks onto a hill to capture a bell, resulting in a Confederate victory. Kyle and Stan point out that they bet over the outcome of the war and not a single battle, so he convinces the drunken reenactors to attack Topeka and then move across the rest of the US. Stan's grandfather is called in to deal with the lack of historical accuracy, with failed attempts at calling in the National Guard that result in Kenny dying, and an attempt at stealing their booze. Ultimately, Cartman is able to rally the people of South Carolina to march on Washington, where he then blackmails Clinton into rewriting history, when Stan and Kyle then interrupt to play into the reenactment fantasy, by pretending to be Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis, signing a treaty that gives the reenactors more booze in exchange for going home. Cartman loses the bet, though since the North won, slavery is outlawed and he does not have to follow through. Shortly after the previous episode was recorded, Mary Kay Bergman passed away, and, not wanting to immediately start looking for a replacement, Trey and Matt opted to write episodes where there were no female characters in a large role. The only women who appear have single lines and are clearly voiced by Trey Parker himself, while Kenny's mother appears briefly, only reading a note in silence. The episode itself is largely inspired by the movie Gettysburg, which had come out recently and that Matt and Trey disliked enough to make fun of. On to the episode itself, this is largely about Cartman's attempts to rewrite history for the usual reasons people try to do this, self-interest. The easiest way to control the narrative in the modern day is to pretend that things have always been a certain way, and then attempt to appeal to tradition and authority. Like with the American Civil War, there is a prevailing argument as to what the war was fought about. Some say slavery, others say it was states' rights. Actually reading through the various Confederate declarations of independence prior to the war will show that the only mention of states' rights prior to the conflict came from states arguing that states' rights had gone too far. Northern states were expressing their right to refuse to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. But these days the narrative has changed in some schools to that of the lost cause, where the discrimination of the past is covered up to make the rebellion appear more sympathetic. Here, the cognitive dissonance that makes people rewrite the actions of their ancestors is used as a justification for a mini-rebellion of sorts within the camp of the Confederate reenactors, to justify an ego trip from the hurt feelings of decades of losing on purpose. Mr. Hankey's Christmas Classics. Mr. Hankey introduces several South Park takes on Christmas classics, including a full version of Mr. Hankey the Christmas Pooh, sung by the stop-motion postman from the old Rankin Bass productions. Kyle's family sings a round about dreidels, with Cartman and Stan providing backup lyrics until they find out that Gerald was actually singing about Courtney Cox. Hitler cries because he doesn't have a Christmas tree, so Satan cheers him up by having all the dead celebrities sing about Christmas time in hell. A quartet of Mr. Mackey's sings Carol of the Bells, okay? Then Cartman sings Oh Holy Night, but he forgets the lyrics and replaces them with praise for the presents that he's about to get. Mr. Garrison sings a piece about how other parts of the world do not celebrate Christmas, and thus they are all heathens who should adopt Western customs or burn in hell. Shelley tries to sing I Saw Three Ships, but when Stan and Kyle make fun of her, she smashes them with her piano. Jesus and Santa do a jazz medley of all the various songs about themselves, but since there are more Jesus songs than Santa songs, Santa starts to sing Duran Duran instead, before leaving the stage in frustration. But Jesus lures him back by finishing their number with a duet of Baby It's Cold Outside. Or is it Duran Duran? Then the main cast comes together for Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, doubling as a send-off for Mary Kay Bergman and all the characters she voiced as they decorate the Christmas tree, ending when a chandelier crushes Kenny. Are you there, God? It's me, Jesus. It's late December, 1999, and everybody is preparing for the new millennium by waiting to see what Jesus is going to do. As they want something bigger than a public appearance, he promises them that God himself will arrive, though God says that the people are not ready, so he instead gets Rod Stewart to play in Las Vegas. Meanwhile, Cartman is celebrating that he started puberty as he got his period, and soon Kenny gets his. What they don't understand is that this is actually a colon infection that's been going around. Kyle is worried that he hasn't started his period yet, so he simply lies to the others, leaving Stan to worry that he's going to be left out. He asks Mr. Mephisto if there's anything that can be done to speed up the process and receives some hormones that he begins to abuse, though he still does not get a period. This comes to a head at Vegas, where Jesus is worried about the people demanding a god who is not going to show up. As the angry mob prepares a crucifix, Stan asks for advice on why his prayers are not being answered, and Jesus tells him that God can't do everything for us or there would be no purpose to life. Upon this epiphany, God finally appears and tells the people of Earth that he can answer one question for them, a single question that Stan uses to answer why he never got his period. Episodes like Ike's Wee Wee have had similar plots to this one, where the kids' misunderstanding of a subject combined with the general lack of help from the adults in their lives leads to a series of misunderstandings caused by the panic of a situation that was never dire in the first place. Here it's about puberty, and the boys fearing that they aren't starting it due to the fact that nobody but God was willing to tell them about periods. American society in general is very bad at properly teaching sexual wellness and education to kids, especially preteens, as there's an idea that we can keep kids pure by simply never telling them about adult subjects, and that surely going blindly into adulthood means they'll be sent into adulthood in a pure-hearted way, or something stupid like that. Trey and Matt have always criticized this way of thinking in adults, that children are somehow pure of soul and that they learn bad behavior from society. In this episode, the adults refuse to mention anything about puberty under the belief that the kids are too young to hear such a thing, and yet not knowing what's going on only leads them to get terrible infections from improper tampon use, so the awkwardness around the subject that made people so apprehensive to bring it up wound up causing a lot more harm than good, not that it benefited anyone in the first place. Worldwide Recorder Concert. The worldwide recorder concert is about to happen. Millions of elementary schoolers under the guidance of Yoko Ono and Kenny G playing a song together. But Mr. Garrison is concerned about visiting Arkansas as his family lives there, and he's concerned about visiting his old demons, specifically concerned because his father did not molest him growing up, and he thinks this means he didn't love him. So Mr. Mackey goes to Mr. Garrison Sr. and talks to him about this, and after an unproductive talk with his own friends, Garrison Sr. makes the compromise to have Kenny G pretend to be him and sneak into Garrison's room at night. Meanwhile, the South Park kids are upset that the kids from New York are making fun of them, but Cartman's research into the brown note, a note that makes you void your bowels, yields some results, and they scheme to replace the New York kids' music with a version that includes it. But the head director finds this sheet music and reprints it for the entire gathering. In the end, they all play the brown note and the entire world voids its bowels at once, though at least this earns the respect of the other kids when they learn that Stan, Kyle, and Cartman were engineering it. At the end of this episode, the boys are happy to have gotten the approval from a bunch of guys who found the entire world collectively voiding their bowels to be cool, which, if you think about it long enough, makes you realize that maybe these were not the type of people you should be trying to win the approval of. But this isn't a lesson that they take away, instead wading through puddles of feces in triumph, unaware that they craved the acceptance of people whose disdain they wouldn't accept. To quote another show I have covered, "Your boos mean nothing, I've seen what makes you cheer." Another character who has mixed feelings on acceptance or rejection is Mr. Garrison, here believing that his father never molested him because he was not good enough to treat that way. And while we, the audience, can tell that this is an absurd position to have, in universe it's portrayed as a more serious crisis and one that raises a question interesting enough to the other men at Mr. Garrison Sr.'s bar. Should you do something you don't morally agree with for the sake of another person's happiness, even if that thing could be construed as harmful? And while the father-son relationship here is obviously meant to be a comedic exaggeration, the same principle can be applied to something as simple as accepting a kid even though they want a dumb tattoo, and maybe even driving them to the parlor to show your support. Despite not condoning the idea, you can at least support the person who has it. South Park, the movie. Bigger, longer, and uncut. The musical opens with Stan singing about the quiet mountain town he lives in as he recruits all his friends to sneak into the Terrance and Phillip movie in spite of their parents' wishes. Most of the moviegoers are disgusted, but the boys have a great time, and proceed to impress all the other kids at school with the new vocabulary they've learned, though Stan is mostly concerned with the fact that Wendy is smitten with a new boy, Gregory, who seems to be very politically active. After getting in trouble at school for cursing, the angry parents have their kids sent to Mr. Mackey's anti-swearing rehab, but after they leave, they simply watch the Terrance and Phillip movie a second time. As they are leaving, Cartman bets Kenny that lighting a fart on fire cannot actually happen, so Kenny disproves him, dying by self-immolation in the process and being sent to hell. The adults try to figure out who to blame, and rather than accepting that it's themselves, decide to blame Canada, with Terrance and Phillip being arrested and an execution date being set. Canada and the US argue over the arrest of their citizens, and the Canadians retaliate by bombing the Baldwins, to which the US government declares an all-out war. The kids, led by Gregory, decide not to take this and make a plan for a revolution to protect their rights, something Stan joins to get closer to Wendy. Cartman joins in too, as the Mothers Against Canada group has implanted a V-chip into Cartman as a proof of concept to prevent anyone from cursing with electric shocks. So he gets zapped before he can sing about how Kyle's mom is a zap. But Kenny overhears Satan and Saddam discussing a prophecy that when Canada and the US go to war, he will be able to return to the surface the second Terrance and Phillip have their blood spilled. The boys try to talk their parents out of this, but cannot get their attention, so they wonder what would Brian Boitano do, and formally create La Resistance, promising punch and pie to anyone who shows up. At this meeting, Gregory offers to break into a USO show to rescue Terrance and Phillip, but Stan leads his friends in doing it themselves to impress Wendy. Act 2 ends with a marathon song involving everyone's motivations as Ike is placed into the attic to hide him from the wave of anti-Canadian sentiment. The day of the USO show comes, and the boys have contacted the Mole to help them infiltrate it and free Terrance and Phillip before their execution. Stan and Kyle convince Big Gay Al to put on a musical performance to drag out the show and buy the Mole more time, though Cartman, getting freaked out by Kenny's ghost and failing to turn off the security system, gets this plan thwarted, and the new guy is killed. Mr. Garrison is about to pull the switch when Cartman's V-chip interferes with the power flow and Terrance and Phillip are freed, with Canada invading at that moment and the war formally breaking out. The boys run through the battlefield to the horror of their mothers, who realize they haven't protected anyone and they all quit. But in spite of the kids protecting Terrance and Phillip with their lives, Sheila shoots them anyway, and Satan rises to the surface. But Saddam tries to claim a personal victory, and with some urging from Kenny and a bit of curse-powered lightning powers courtesy of Cartman's failing V-chip, Satan banishes his partner back to hell. As a thanks for saving the day, Satan offers Kenny one wish, and Kenny uses it to bring everything back to normal, despite this meaning he will stay dead. Though instead of going back to hell, Kenny is granted admission into heaven as Satan takes Mr. Hat down with him. South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut was originally going to have a different name along the lines of Hell Breaks Loose, though hell can't be mentioned in an advertisement for an animated feature, so it had to be changed. Bigger, Longer, and Uncut was approved, and then a week later the producers finally got the joke, but by then it was too late to change it. The movie has exactly 399 instances of profanity in it, perfectly threading the upper threshold of an R rating, though Team America World Police has since broken this record, broken again by The Wolf of Wall Street. The reason for this level of profanity has to do with the general feeling during the creation of the movie. Typically, TV shows that got films were viewed with an air of indifference, as though people thought, oh great, this guy again. The second season of South Park already had a bit of controversy, not so much for its content, but the fact that audiences saw a decline in quality. Thus, the movie was viewed as a swan song for the South Park franchise, a last hurrah before they were cancelled and their careers were over. Even the executives working on the film didn't seem to be too fond of Matt and Trey, who theorized they were only let into the production as they still had to voice so many of the cast. This was especially true after an incident in which they stole the original trailer for the film for making it look bad, and the fact that they suddenly changed it to a musical without telling anyone. But South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut was a success, not on paper, as Hollywood accounting means it's still technically a net loss, and they apparently have seen no money from it. And Blame Canada was even nominated for an Academy Award, losing out to Phil Collins, which they're totally not still bitter about, to this day. It's not as though this was an especially big honor to the guys, though. They decided that as a joke, they would wear dresses to the awards show, something that has apparently prevented them from ever being invited back to the Academy Awards in the future, not as though they care. What the song Blame Canada also did was exemplify a lot of what the movie wanted to be about in the first place. It was written in broad strokes over the course of a single session, with the details getting filled in later. Matt and Trey knew about Terrance and Phillip and a war with Canada, but when the Columbine shooting happened, they asked for a bit of extra time. Nothing to do with the shooting, they just wanted the extra time, and revised it to be a bit less directly derivative of the Season 1 episode Death. The parents blame Canada for all their problems, leading to a massive wave of xenophobia for the same reasons most waves of paranoia and discrimination occur, covering up personal failings. If they blame Canada, then they don't have to acknowledge that they raised their kids to be impressionable, or that they weren't better role models. Cartman gets a chip like a pet who barks too much instead of a proper explanation from the authority figures in his life as to why swearing constantly might make people take you less seriously, or exclude you from polite company. Or they could have better connected Kenny's death to Terrance and Phillip's antics to explain why Canadians are bad role models, instead of trying to ban them outright. Again, a lot of this part of the movie is just pulled from the lessons taught in Death, so ground does get retread quite a bit. The Tooth Fairy's Tats, 2000. After going overboard on a scheme to hide teeth acquired around the neighborhood beneath Cartman's pillow, his mother tells him that the Tooth Fairy is not real, and the other boys soon confirm this with their parents, causing Kyle to have an existential crisis. But Stan gets the idea to continue their racket, but with wealthy children from the Cherry Creek neighborhood, only to bump into another group of kids doing the same thing. They're taken to Loogie, the child in charge of the Tooth Fairy racket, and he lets them run the South Park territory in exchange for a cut of the profit. Though Cartman gets the idea to cut him out of the loop entirely and keep the money for themselves, to which Loogie responds by trying to drown Kenny. Meanwhile, the American Dental Association starts to grow suspicious of the teeth that have gone missing, and come to the conclusion that a half-chicken, half-squirrel hybrid is stealing them, but one man suggests a Tooth Fairy racket and investigates on his own. He does this by setting up a fake news story about a sick child getting a large gift, which baits the South Park boys, as well as Loogie, over. They are busted around the same time that Kyle's existential nightmare hits its peak and he phases out of existence, becoming the chicken squirrel and fighting off the dentists and the mobsters. The South Park take on a mafia flick, complete with taking the general child's view of the pastiche and then adding an increasingly absurd element until the point at which the problem is solved by a 9-year-old manifesting a squirrel chicken and a tooth fairy heist. A good portion of the humor of this show comes from explicitly setting up certain pop culture references, and then either playing them realistically or doing the exact opposite. This is how we can have Kenny about to drown at the episode's midpoint, only for the river to be too shallow at first, and then drown him anyway in a post-credits sequence, also something done more frequently this season. And normally these movies have some sort of moral lesson taught at the end about hubris as we watch the downfall of a greedy character, but Loogie only stops exploiting kids for tooth fairy money because he is losing his edge, and he wanted to sign up for flag football instead. Cartman's Silly Hate Crime, 2000. The girls challenge the boys to a sled race, a race the boys are sure to win because they have the overweight Cartman on their side. But when Cartman throws a rock at Token for pointing this out, he is taken to juvenile hall for his supposed hate crime. Stan, Kyle, and Kenny try to find another way to weigh down their sleigh, but only succeed in getting Kenny killed, causing them to plan a way to get Cartman out of jail. In jail, Cartman is cellmates with Romper Stomper, a tough kid who makes him smuggle things into the cell. But after Cartman breaks down crying, he decides to plan an escape attempt, though this attempt was pointless as Cartman was pardoned shortly afterwards. The reason for this pardon was that Stan and Kyle were able to work with Token's parents to convince the state governor to rescind hate crime laws in the interest of equality. Once freed, Cartman is able to race the girls, catching up to them by throwing Romper Stompers, thanking him for the gift later by smuggling Disneyland into the prison. Cartman gets sent to jail for the assumed intention behind throwing a rock at Token instead of the actual intention of getting back at Kyle. The idea being that what he did could have been a hate crime and therefore was punished as though it were one. There's a sense of irony in the fact that the entire thing could theoretically be dropped if Token would only step forward and claim that he was not offended, except the people doing the punishment would not listen to a black kid. Oftentimes, groups with a guilty conscience will try to speak on the behalf of bereaved parties in order to deflect this guilt without ever actually listening to the people they claim to speak for, as though they are not smart or capable enough to know what is best for them. Stan and Kyle then solved this wrong by recommitting it and speaking on the behalf of the minority group. They argue that the hate crime label ought not to exist by misinterpreting the name literally. If you hate something, it's a hate crime. Their point comes down to the idea that there shouldn't be a label for such a thing, as it infantilizes an actual minority group, ignoring again the fact that hate crimes can be committed against non-minority groups. Of course, South Park is self-aware enough of this fact to avoid getting flack for this. They named the school's only black student Token, after all, although perhaps some of the fans missed this bit of satire. Timmy, 2000. Timmy is struggling to pay attention in class due to his learning disability, but Mr. Mackey diagnoses it as attention deficit disorder, putting him on Ritalin, and then when the kids find out that they can get excused from homework if they get a diagnosis, putting the rest of them on Ritalin too. Nearby, a band called the Lords of the Underworld is rehearsing, although they suck at it, until hearing Timmy shouting his own name, just what their sound needs in the upcoming battle of the bands. They win this contest, as they were booed the least, and then head out to open for Phil Collins at the Lollapalooza concert. But Phil Collins considers the cheers for Timmy and the Lords of the Underworld as insulting and exploitative, and tries to fight against the band's inclusion at his concert, eventually settling on trying to break up the band by convincing Skylar to go solo. The children begin hallucinating Christina Aguilera monsters as a side effect of their Ritalin dosages, with Cartman smashing Kenny's face in as a result, as well as enjoying Phil Collins' music and planning to see him in concert at the Lollapalooza. But Chef is concerned with the drug abuse and after failing to convince the parents to simply hit their children, has the pharmacist from earlier dose the kids with Rital out after shaming them for turning them into Phil Collins fans. Upon sobering up, Stan chastises Phil Collins for trying to stop Timmy's career, and his band gets back together. You are never going to find a human being who is completely well-adjusted. Everybody has something wrong with them, though some students will certainly have a harder time fitting in than others. Several decades ago, this sort of abnormal behavior was fixed the way Chef suggested, simply beating kids until they acted normal, driving home the idea in their head that something was wrong with them. Today, modern therapy is a lot more accepting of this sort of behavior, and treatment comes down to asking people on an individual level how weird they want to be. Surely people who have legitimate trouble integrating into society will want to be able to at least go to school and work like a normal person. But some people want to make several hours-long videos about cartoons, and some people want to watch these videos, and neither of these people wants to be considered weird in a way that excludes them from polite society. The end of the episode then posits that behavioral change can only happen on a society-wide level after a period of inappropriate behavior. Sure, if kids like Timmy go to school, they are going to be called weird and made fun of. But after a while, that novelty wears off, and soon the story of the Timmys of the world starts to match the in- and out-of-universe interpretations. Timmy was invented for a bit in the Tooth Fairy's tats, only to be received so well by audiences that they started asking for more and more of him. And sure, Timmy shouting his name is usually a punchline, but everything in the show is a punchline. And the slow path to acceptance will never happen if anyone abnormal is kept inside their parents' attic until they're old enough for a lobotomy. Quintuplets to whatever. The boys and their families go to see a French circus, with the boys bored for most of it until seeing Romanian quintuplets performing, and getting the idea to start their own circus, though they can't get any of their stunts done right, which they blame on Kenny's singing. So Kenny practices singing some more, eventually managing to raise money with performances to go to a conservatory in Europe. Meanwhile, the quintuplets are fleeing Romanian authorities trying to bring them back to their home country, with their grandmother bringing them to the Marsh household where they spend the night, only for their grandmother to die post-coitus with Grandpa Marsh. With no parent left, an international incident breaks out between the Romanian government and the American one over whether the quintuplets should be sent home, or if they have a right to stay, culminating in Janet Reno disguising as the Easter Bunny and tear-gassing the house before stealing the girls away. But Stan, wanting his circus back, leads the protesters that have gathered in a raid on the government compound to liberate them. But the girls themselves have had enough of people speaking on their behalf and decide to tour with Oprah instead. Back in Romania, Kenny has become a successful opera singer only for his father to want him back to the US, with US agents killing him by mistake. While writing this episode, Matt and Trey found that they weren't big fans of the original script. Specifically, they couldn't find a satisfactory ending involving the girls telling off the people who had gathered before leaving, and were trying to rework things last minute. But when the Elian Gonzalez story broke that same week, they got the idea to borrow scenes from the photos taken of that raid to explicitly reference the events that had unfolded on the news at the same time. This caused a lot of the audience to be amazed at the quick turnaround on episodes, as the photos, scenes in the episodes were based on, were only 4 days old at the time of airing. This positive reaction, as well as the fact that the episode could then write itself as they simply needed to find a mouthpiece for their take on the story, created a new method for writing stories going forward. Rip something from the headlines, and then keep the show topical. Cartman joins NAMBLA. Cartman decides that he wants more mature friends and goes online to find some, meeting up with pedophiles who keep getting arrested. As these men are in jail, NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, protests their incarceration, and when this is fruitless, they try to argue that they need a new young boy spokesman to show the world that they're not hurting anyone. They find Cartman, who thinks that he's joining the North American Marlon Brando lookalikes, and he is encouraged to bring all his young boy friends over. Eventually, during a police raid on the hotel NAMBLA is meeting at, the boys finally figure out what is going on, running around Hanna-Barbera style before getting cornered. Meanwhile, Kenny's parents are planning on having another child, though Kenny does not want to split attention with a new kid. So he tries to stop his parents from having this baby, mostly resulting in Kenny's dad getting hit in the nuts. When Kenny chases his mom around with a plunger, his father follows, getting led to the hotel where the raid is taking place, where NAMBLA confuses him for one of the kids. Ultimately, Kenny gets run over by the ambulance called for his dad, and the new child is born, who looks exactly like Kenny, and named after him, the 52nd time this has happened. South Park has always had some aspects of parody to it, but in this instance they were able to pull from certain real-life aspects beyond the realm of parody. Most people watching this episode assumed that NAMBLA was something Trey and Matt invented for the show, but it's real. Not the Marlon Brando lookalikes, at least not to my knowledge. But by raising such extreme examples from human behavior, South Park draws comparisons and then forces people to confront less clean parts of society. The Man-Boy Love Association claims that their beliefs are being persecuted, and that they have as much a right to express their lifestyle as anyone else. This is compared to any other minority group fighting for their struggles, and therefore we have to ask, when it comes to social progress, where do we draw the line? Of course, this is not a question with some sort of avoidable answer. The exact location of this line is something up for debate, but the fact that the line exists is not. You can think for yourself to determine whether or not NAMBLA has a right to groom children, but what you ought not to do is allow their existence to shut down similar discussions with the slippery slope fallacy. The idea that any progress will inevitably be perverted and exaggerated to an extreme extent, because no matter what, that line will still be drawn somewhere. Cherokee hair tampons. Due to his arrest last episode, Mr. Garrison is told to take a hiatus from teaching, and after a therapy session, decides to write a romance novel. Meanwhile, Kyle is seriously ill due to a kidney failure caused by his diabetes. Miss Broflovsky takes him to a holistic medicine store to get all-natural remedies from a misinformation, rather than Western medicine. Kyle doesn't get any better, but misinformation convinces the families that his vomiting is just the removal of toxins. So Stan goes to the doctor and learns that Kyle needs a transplant, and the only match is Cartman. But Cartman refuses to give up his kidney to Kyle and has a series of protections on it to stop Stan and the others from simply stealing it. Soon, Sheila takes Kyle back to Misinformation where her Indian healers, actually a couple of Hispanic dudes pawning junk, realize that Kyle is actually sick and they reveal Misinformation is just a con artist. So the adults, no longer believing in holistic medicine, scheme to trick Cartman into thinking his kidney is gone so he will sign a release to consent to surgery, saving Kyle's life. Mr. Garrison, having written a romance novel that's exclusively about men's genitals, announces that he's retiring from teaching to be an author. Misinformation in this episode is viewed as a con artist, her primary mark being people who are scared. No one is more scared than a mother about to lose her child, or a person about to lose a friend, so preying on this fear can keep people buying basically anything, as it's an easy emotion to exploit. One of the best ways to produce fear is to produce doubt. To convince people that modern medicine doesn't know what it's doing because there are a few problems with it, that any system that's not perfect is therefore worthy of throwing away entirely. Of course, the holistic garbage Misinformation pushes is far worse, but when it comes to con artists, it's not about solving problems, but convincing people that their problems are being solved. To convince somebody that all the bugs are features and that they just have to double down and spend a little more money. And all you have to do is get somebody hooked once, and then it's easier and easier for them to ignore evidence and give in more to misinformation. Because it's almost impossible to convince the victims of a con that they are a victim. They'll just say you don't understand, or they'll repeat a slogan they've been told about how things are better if you ignore the truth. Stan tries to tell Kyle's mom that the medicine doesn't work, but to do that he has to first convince her there's a possibility she was wrong. Once you fall for this sort of con a little bit, going deeper is easier, but resurfacing is not easy, as people's egos will always fight back. Chef goes nanners. A debate is raging in South Park over whether their current flag depicting 4 white figures hanging a black one is racist and must be changed. This debate reaches South Park Elementary, where the class is split into 2 groups about the issue, with one side of the debate led by Eric and Wendy, despite Cartman's typical method of storming out of debates and declaring himself winner. When Chef realizes that Stan and Kyle are on the side of keeping it, he changes his name and doubles down on his efforts to prove that it's racist, getting the attention of the Ku Klux Klan, who start to march on the side of Jimbo. But as Jimbo does not want to associate with actual racists, he and Ned disguise themselves as Klan members to convince them to switch sides, as people are sure to vote against them. Wendy keeps having dreams about Cartman, getting advice from Bebe to kiss him and let the feelings out, which she does, much to Stan's horror, before presenting their argument. In the end, when Kyle presents his findings, he doesn't mention race, as he never saw the skin color of the people depicted, and Chef realizes that focusing so much on race only calls more attention to it. In the end, the city of South Park changes their flag to a multicultural lynch mob, which makes everyone happy. This episode has its characters raise the question of whether an old symbol is racist or if it's historically crucial, and yet they never bother to posit a third position. Yes to both. A flag depicting an old-school lynching of a specific race, or even just a symbol closely associated with this behavior, can be both racist and historically accurate, and both sides ought to recognize that these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, not combining these two facts winds up presenting a dishonest view of your own land. To argue that the flag ought to remain as is, while simultaneously refusing to accept that it has a negative connotation, winds up diminishing history and the lessons that can be learned from it. But to argue that it's racist but has no historical value likewise ignores the actual history to be taken, and to ignore the problems of the past or dismiss them as a one-off freak incident means that no one will learn from what has been agreed on as a mistake. South Park was created in part as a counter to the argument that kids are innocent and are only corrupted later in life, yet here it's this exact statement that winds up being made. Stan and Kyle don't see color in the people on the flag, yet it's not as though that color wasn't there originally. It's never good to rewrite history, and reinterpreting like this is just rewriting it with extra steps. Not saying race is good, but only if everyone does it. As long as the Klan is still allowed the freedom of speech to march, which they ought to, then it's important to understand that being neutral on the subject means that society will lean in their direction. You don't make progress by getting enough people together to ignore an issue really, really hard. Progress is made by offsetting those against it. Something you can do with your finger. Cartman has a dream that he is in a boy band named Fingerbang and thinks that it's prophetic. So he gets his friends together to make a boy band and become famous to get $10 million, recruiting a cross-dressing Wendy as you can't have a 4-member boy band. They struggle with getting past mall security, shooting a decent video, and convincing Randy Marsh to allow Stan to perform, although a fake orange smoothie announcement and some advice from Chef get past the first 2 hurdles. All that's left is to convince Randy to let Stan out, which he only does after explaining that he was once in a boy band himself, only for the popularity to be fleeting and his life turned into a joke. But when Stan says that he still respects his father, Randy allows them to perform after all, only for Kenny to be crushed by an elevator. So Randy takes his place and they perform to like 20 people, making $2, and then citing that they're now too famous, so they quit. Boy bands were a lot bigger in the aughts, which is why this parody worked better back then, but these days the boy bands that are popular have nowhere near the cultural reach they once did. Most facets of these bands are still unchanged, from the manufactured popularity Chef points out to the lack of actual music talent due to it not being the appeal. Some members of these bands go on to have solo careers afterwards where they can be a bit more creatively honest, but more of them end up like Randy Marsh. This is one of the episodes that really shows Randy developing into his own character, no longer just Stan's dad. In later seasons, we'll often see that he's more of a central focus than any of the main 4/5/4, but for now the episodes where he plays a bigger role than any of the kids are still uncommon. A few times a season, as the show is still primarily about kids themselves, as Matt and Trey are still putting their personal experience into writing, and for now, they relate more to foul-mouthed children than domestic adults. Do the handicapped go to hell? After a sermon about hell terrifies them, the boys decide they have to go to Sunday school, where the teacher, Sister Anne, encourages them to start writing down their sins for a confession. But as they're writing these, they realize that Timmy cannot speak his sins, and therefore will go to hell by default. Kyle starts to worry about what might happen if his parents are wrong about their faith, and encourages Ike to go to a confession with him, as Cartman confesses the various things he's done to Father Maxey that results in the man strangling him, though Cartman believes this was the hand of God. They rush back to confess more sins, only for Kenny to get hit by a bus, and when they finally get to the church, they see Father Maxey fornicating in the confession booth. Losing their faith in the man, Cartman decides to become a preacher himself to save the kids of South Park from burning in hell. Meanwhile, in hell, Satan is moving in with his new boyfriend Chris, only for Saddam to come back telling Satan that he has changed. Chris tries to talk things out like adults, but Satan is torn between the bad boy of Saddam and the stability of Chris. After calling out Saddam's name in bed, he leaves to get some fresh air and finds himself outside of Saddam's place. There's a philosophical argument in favor of religion arguing the following. If a person never worships and the atheists are correct, then nothing happens, but if they're wrong, then that person burns in hell. On the other hand, if they do worship and the atheists are correct, then nothing happens, but if they worship and the atheists are wrong, they get eternal salvation. The idea that the best-case scenario for non-religious individuals is the same as the worst-case scenario for the church-going. Of course, this is a reductive argument. To quote a great American philosopher, Homer Simpson, "What if we picked the wrong religion? Every week, we're just making God madder and madder. It's an assumption that there is no nuance to spirituality and that there's only a single correct religion. That is to say, what if the Mormons were right all along and you went to hell no matter how good of a Protestant you were? Probably. The parents are failing to get to their children as Cartman orders them to build a mighty church based on his schematics. Miss Cartman tries to bribe Cartman with food and toys, but he simply goes back to the church, healing various parishioners like a faith healer, slapping them and then moving on. After a while of this, he starts to demand money from the churchgoers, which confuses Stan and Kyle. They then see Cartman rolling in a pile of cash, bragging about how successful the scheme was, as he never truly believed it after all. Then Sister Anne returns with somebody who has more authority than Cartman, Jesus, and he tells the kids in Cartman's church to live life well rather than following others as they walk out to go be kids again. Down in hell, Chris has forgiven Saddam for cheating on him, which Satan views as a sign of weakness. Soon Chris and Saddam are killing each other over and over, reincarnating in hell over and over as, where else would they go, Detroit? Ultimately, Satan turns to his old acquaintance God about what to do, learning that he needs to be happy with himself before he can be happy with someone else. He dumps both men and sends Saddam to heaven, where he is surrounded by Mormons, as it turns out they were the right ones. Both plots in this episode actually follow the same general idea, solved by the idea of doing things for your personal benefit so that you can then do things for the benefit of others. Morality is not some clear-cut thing. Sure, a lot of things can be agreed to be good not just for oneself, but society in general, but the details of these deeds can imply context. For example, a person who does good things purely because they're afraid of divine punishment isn't actually a good person, just a scared one. They could just as easily be threatened into feeding Cartman's ego and throwing money towards a con man running a megachurch that does no good for anyone. If you are afraid of God, then you're afraid of basically everything. Similar to this idea that self-worth ought to be derived internally is Satan's plotline. He has spent so much of his life in relationships that he's failed to figure out how to be happy by himself rather than by defining his life through the people close to him. Because you are closer to yourself than anyone else is, and thus you know better how to define your own boundaries and what makes you good or not. If somebody else tries to tell you what's good for you, or good for society, or good for your God, there's a good chance they're really just explaining what's good for them. Fourth grade. The kids are now in 4th grade, and they meet their new teacher, Miss Chokesondik. But she's much tougher than Mr. Garrison and shuts down their plans to enforce dominance over the classroom, making Cartman nostalgic for the good old days of 3rd grade. So the kids find 2 nerds and ask them to create a time machine with Timmy's wheelchair. But the machine goes haywire and flings Timmy into the streets, unable to slow down without the power cell igniting. After a failed attempt at slowing him down, the chair finally succeeds in traveling Timmy back in time, which makes the kids want to try it again. But they cannot do this as the nerds who built the time machine are fighting over how many episodes are in the original Star Trek. But when they tell these nerds they can simply use the machine themselves to ask Gene Roddenberry, they agree and a new time machine is created that opens a portal inside of their 4th grade classroom. Meanwhile, Miss Chokesondik tracks down Mr. Garrison to try and learn how to reach the kids, and he sets her on a series of trials, one of which involves a tree of insight that Garrison himself goes through, to accept at last that he is gay. Miss Chokesondik finally manages to calm the class down and convinces him to not actually go back in time, while Mr. Garrison asks for his old job back, only to be told by South Park Elementary that they don't hire gay people. Miss Chokesondik was originally shot down by censors in early episodes of South Park unless Trey and Matt specifically met the condition that her name be pronounced as Chokesondik, to make it sound like it was Eastern European or something. After receiving this note, they then instructed all the voice actors, most of whom were themselves, to put extra emphasis on each syllable. Chokes on dick. Anyway, Chokesondik gives a demotivational speech to her class at the end of this episode that ironically deviates a lot from what Garrison would have done, but is now an aspect of what he will be. She tells the kids that there are 2 possible ways to view the past. Through the lens that it was better, meaning that since your life was well lived, you did everything right and it's not something that needs to be redone, or that it was worse, in which case why would you want to go back and relive it? It's a level-headed response that she got from a man who is now level-headed, at least relative to before. Mr. Garrison finally outs himself, seeming to throw away his old poorly disguised homophobia, only to encounter the subtle type of homophobia that was so pervasive in other many parts of the aughts. Trapper Keeper. Cartman is bragging about his new Trapper Keeper, specifically that it is better than Kyle, though it also gathers the attention of a suspicious older man who calls himself Bill Cosby and speaks in stilted English. Bill tries to get closer to Cartman before eventually stealing the Trapper Keeper for himself and running away. So Cartman calls the police to run him down, only to learn that the man is a robot. He was sent from the future to destroy the device as it kept combining with nearby technology before taking over the entire world. Cartman pretends to let Bill destroy it, but has his mom buy him a new one that eventually absorbs Cartman and kills Kenny before heading to a nearby military base. Meanwhile, Ike is having his first day of kindergarten as he skipped a few grades, led by Mr. Garrison, who has the class elect a president. The choices are between Fillmore and Ike, and the election is called a tie with a girl named Flora being undecided. She votes for Ike, but then an absent kid votes for Fillmore, with the kid calling in his famous Aunt Rosie to help with the recount. Garrison kicks her out as the kids agree to just let Ike be president since it doesn't matter much anyway, and Rosie leaves to get her lawyers, only for the Akira monster to absorb her and get sick enough for Kyle to finally remove Cartman's brain, Space Odyssey style. The election plotline of this episode is directly based on the American election of 2000, with Florida's votes coming in late being the undecided Flora. This, combined with a confusing ballot system and people wanting to change their votes after realizing they don't like either candidate, showed the general exhaustion many people felt towards the entire cycle, though nothing was quite as exhausting to Matt and Trey as the celebrities forcing themselves into the middle of it all. They argued this wasn't a way for people to truly express concerns about the legitimacy of the democratic process, but a way to promote themselves and come across as politically relevant. There is still a bit of irony in the fact that they aired this grievance about famous people complaining about politics by complaining about politics to 3.27 million people across the US. Helen Keller, the Musical. The fourth graders are putting on the Helen Keller musical, trying to compete with the kindergartners' Thanksgiving play by adding more special effects and getting a performing turkey. Kyle and Timmy are sent to buy the turkey, where Timmy sees a crippled turkey he names Gobbles, and convinces Kyle to buy it to save the turkey's life. The rest of the cast of the play is upset that Gobbles cannot do tricks, and they bring in a professional, feet-performing turkey named Alanicia, who refuses to perform alongside Gobbles. But they can't convince Timmy to drop his new pet, as he's the only one who can play Helen, and after their attempts at assassination fail and hit Kenny instead, Alanicia's trainer convinces Timmy that people are coming for Gobbles, and he needs to abandon the turkey. Gobbles gets captured and sent to the slaughterhouse, though he avoids decapitation due to his disability, and escapes into the wild, where Timmy, having learned of this deception, dives in front of the animal to save it from a bullet. He then rushes back to the stage even though his part has been given to a local professional, where the hunters kill Alanicia, and Gobbles is finally able to perform his trick, giving the performance a standing ovation. South Park makes a lot of jokes at the expense of its disabled cast. Simply having Timmy yell his name while looking silly is itself a joke at his expense. And yet, South Park also has a lot of jokes at the expense of the rest of its cast. It makes jokes at their own expense. It makes fun of everybody equally. Because of this fact, it means that the disabled characters in South Park wind up being characters rather than one-off instances meant to say something about respect before being quietly swept off to the side. Timmy isn't a cast member because Matt and Trey were trying to hit some sort of internal diversity quota, but because they felt they had a reason to add a disabled character to the cast that wasn't simply being the butt of a joke. That this episode can tell a story that many find to be touching about a character with an extremely limited vocabulary is proof enough of this. Timmy is a character we're meant to laugh at, but only for a little while, and then he becomes a character that we can laugh with. Pip. Malcolm McDowell introduces a retelling of the literary classic Great Expectations, starring everyone's favorite South Park character Pip. After helping out an escaped convict, Pip returns home to his life as a blacksmith's apprentice, where he's encouraged to get a real job. He answers an ad for a playmate for a young girl, Estella, getting repeatedly insulted by her and rejected for not being a gentleman, all while Miss Havisham bides her time on her scheme to break his heart. But Pip is soon sent away to London to be a proper gentleman, returning to dance with Estella at a ball where he learns that she is already dating a guy who has a car. Pip feels heartbroken, which is the final part of Miss Havisham's plan to activate a Genesis device by collecting the tears of Estella's ex-lovers so she can become eternally youthful. Pip gathers his old friends, including the escaped convict, who it turns out was the one funding his lifestyle, and they attack the manor, convincing the men not to cry as Pip convinces Estella that she has a heart by making her kill bunnies. In the end, despite the waves of robot monkeys, Miss Havisham's Genesis device is thwarted by Estella leaving, and the house explodes as everyone lives happily ever after, unless they died of hepatitis B. While writing this story, Trey and Matt set out to make the worst possible South Park episode that they could. They achieved this by combining their demographics' most hated things, mandatory assigned readings, and the British. Pip had already been more or less written out of the show, only having background appearances for the next few seasons and going several seasons afterwards without a single speaking role. But rather than simply removing an unpopular character, Matt and Trey decided to make absolutely sure everyone was okay with him going missing by boring them with high school reading first. Fat Camp. At the behest of his mother and friends, Cartman is sent to a weight management camp, feeling betrayed by this and attempting to escape, though he keeps getting caught and sent back. After a while, he returns to South Park, much thinner and nicer than before. Stan and Kyle are confused by this new Cartman, though they're more focused on Kenny to care. After eating a manatee spleen on a dare during school, they realize that Kenny will do just about anything for money, so they start to promote this, ultimately giving Kenny his own TV show. But after he's arrested for prostitution during an appearance on the Howard Stern show, Stan and Kyle are worried that they don't have anybody to do something I don't think I can allude to and keep the video monetized. But around this time, Kyle finally realizes what's wrong with Cartman, namely, that he's a completely different person pretending to be Cartman so he can smuggle candy and snacks into the fat camp. Cartman will then sell these to the dieting kids. They force this fake Cartman to do Kenny's act, dying in the process, while back at the fat camp, the place is about to be shut down due to none of the kids losing weight, although the children ultimately come clean about Cartman's store and decide to try to lose the weight for real, except for Cartman, who stress eats from the rejection. This episode is the episode I would always think of whenever I considered reviewing South Park in the past. This is the one where I first think, there's no way I can describe this episode properly and get around censors, and then after resolving to ignore that anxiety, I then think, there's no way I can describe this episode in a way that doesn't make the entire video sound stupid. The A-plot about Cartman faking his way out of fat camp so he can smuggle junk food inside is the same Cartman that finally reaches coalescence in the next season's episode, Scott Tenorman Must Die. He's finally becoming that proper sociopath, building on a streak of greed that's been forming all season. Most plots that Cartman initiates now are either because he's trying to make his friends look bad, or he wants $10 million. Being a jerk because he's a 9-year-old is one thing, but being a jerk in an elaborate way and then profiting off of it is a unique kind of sociopathy that defines Cartman as a character, and lacking sympathy for the people in the same boat as he is just the icing on the snack cakes that he's selling. The Wacky Molestation Adventure. Kyle wants to go to a concert with his friends, but his parents tell him he cannot go until he cleans the garage, shovels the driveway, and brings democracy to Cuba. But even after writing a letter to Castro, his parents don't allow him to go, so, at the advice of Cartman, he calls the police and claims that they molested him. The children then party at Kyle's house, as there are no adults to tell them not to, getting the idea to get rid of their own parents the same way. A couple has their car break down in Smiley Town and searches for a mechanic, or at least an adult, and they soon learn that there are only children in the overrun junk town. While searching for a phone, this couple is thrust into the middle of a power struggle between two factions over control of a book, the possessor of the book not having to sacrifice a member of their cult to the statue of John Elway. But after his wife is taken hostage by the mayor, Cartman, the man gives a speech about the before times with adults being around, and that using the M-word to banish them was wrong. The kids undo the mistake they made with their parents returning as they apologize for the crime they were brainwashed into thinking they did. If it's not already obvious, Matt and Trey are big fans of the original Star Trek, and this episode's second act plot is almost exactly copied from the TOS episode Miri. Here, instead of the adults disappearing as a result of genetic engineering gone wrong, they are gone as the kids wanted more freedom and made false accusations. In the world of South Park, the court of public opinion has more value than the real courts, and society is run based on the reactionary statements made by political pundits and ill-informed viewers and readers. The show depicts a world where all of the laws are written by someone who just read a headline of an article and has already formed a strong opinion about it. So if Star Trek can depict an episode about geneticists going too far, South Park will then make an episode about rage bait being taken to the same extreme. A very crappy Christmas. After staying up all night waiting for a Mr. Hankey who never comes, Kyle recruits the others to find out what happened to him, and they learn he has a family now and does not have the time to spread holiday cheer. So they get the idea from watching Charlie Brown to make their own Christmas movie titled The Spirit of Christmas, receiving a stipend from the mayor to work on it so they can revitalize the Christmas shopping season. They work all night on the film, making concessions to replace Cartman when he quits due to how long stop-motion animation takes, and barely manage to finish it in time, only for the film to be destroyed by the projector. Mr. Hankey returns home to his alcoholic wife dejected, but his son, Cornwallis, reminds him of a motivational song about the circle of poo that he heard from his father, and they create a miracle, showing the film again and reminding everybody the real meaning of the holiday: presents. An episode of South Park about an episode of South Park, eschewing the typical holiday cliches without actually changing anything about the structure of the episode itself. Here, the boys are concerned that their holiday hero is not getting enough attention because people have learned the wrong lesson of what the holiday season is about. And while this sounds like a normal Christmas episode on the surface, this is not even a surface-level analysis. The holiday hero is a talking turd, and the boys are trying to teach consumerism to people who are too busy enjoying time with their families to go out and buy stuff they don't need. This would come across as satire of the holiday season if it wasn't already so played out within the show. We already know about Mr. Hankey by the end of Season 4, his appearance is no longer a joke in and of itself. So rather than the episode being a satire of the holidays, it's a satire of the satire that Matt and Trey made all those years ago. Specific aspects of the show's creation get parodied, with Stan having to voice most of the characters himself the same way Trey voices most of the cast of South Park. They've made crude humor because that's what made them laugh in the recording booth. The only inaccuracies are the intentional ones, where the Christmas miracle is when they ship the animation process overseas so they don't have to do it themselves, rather than the in-house process that lets the studio put out an episode the same week they came up with the idea. It hits the fan. I upload individual season retrospectives as members-only content, allowing channel members to see piecemeal retrospectives early. As this episode is the first of Season 5, it means the retrospective of this episode will be at the very start of one of those videos. YouTube's monetization policy is unfriendly towards profanity within the first 30 seconds of video, so I'm including this warning purely out of a desire to stretch this out so that I can keep my channel in good standing. The whole town, except for Kyle, is excited about the fact that HBC will be using the word shit in its show Cop Drama. After they say shit, the word becomes normalized, with proper usage being taught in schools. And then, it starts to rain frogs, and a plague spreads around, and an order of knights encased in stone is freed by a cloud of smog caused by the shit spewing. Due to the high ratings of the shit publicity stunt, the HBC executives decide to start saying shit more and more often, to the point that audiences begin to grow tired of the shit. Kyle and Chef are leading the others down a rabbit hole of investigations into the origin of curse words, realizing after one of the knights collapses in front of them that they are literal curses. They take a runestone to the shooting of one of HBC's shows that has by this point replaced its entire script with the word shit over and over. But when they are joined by the Knights of the Standards and Practices, the executive in charge of the shit show begins to say shit repeatedly, causing an ancient dragon to burst out of the ground and start immolating people. Kyle reseals the dragon with the stone before going on live television to plead with audiences not to say shit so often, as it loses its meaning when it's overused. One thing that South Park does exceptionally well is introducing a silly and humorous concept without telling you that it's humorous at first, and then only after the audience has accepted its inclusion in universe, finally revealing the gag. This is done here with the Knights of Standards and Practices, first showing the Knights crusading against the curse words by attacking those who spread its usage, before later revealing the order's name. Had they called them the Standards and Practices during their first appearance, the joke would not have landed as well, and the audience was still deciding whether to take the men seriously as a threat or not. And this is the opposite sort of technique used when introducing crude language and swearing into the series, where the characters curse near constantly, to the point that this episode includes a shit counter at the bottom corner that winds up reaching a number not all that much higher than the swear count of a typical episode. And even then, it's only because they had characters like Mr. Garrison singing songs with all the lyrics being curse words. At this point, even making an episode where the entire gimmick is that they swear a lot barely constitutes a gimmick. Cripple Fight. The boys and Timmy head out to a scouts meeting, unsure of whether they will like it, until meeting Big Gay Al, their scoutmaster, and Jimmy, a disabled stand-up comedian. But the parents of South Park are unsure about an openly gay man being in charge of their children, and they lodge complaints about him, resulting in his expulsion from the organization. But their new scout leader, Mr. Grazier, is a pedophile who takes advantage of his position to sexually abuse the boys, and the kids decide they want their old scoutmaster back by putting on a protest. This protest is accompanied by Jimmy's stand-up comedy, though he gets into a fight with Timmy, who's not only jealous of Jimmy's status as the most popular cripple, but also the way in which the comedian tries to make fun of him in his routine. This fight attracts enough attention that the Colorado Supreme Court rules that the Scouts cannot discriminate against homosexuals, though Big Gay Al refuses to accept the new position, as he doesn't think it's fair to force a private organization to change their beliefs either. At the start of the episode, the Mountain Scout leadership has no idea one of their scoutmasters is homosexual, and as such, they have no issue with him leading, as he has a history of being good at his job and well-liked by the kids. But it's pressure from parents who don't know him but assume that they do that causes him to be forced by the administration to lose that position. Later on, the kids are able to sway public sentiment to be in favor of allowing gay scoutmasters once more, resulting in the state nearly disbanding the organization for its discriminatory history. But Big Gay Al says he doesn't want this to happen, as he still believes that the organization should not be forced by public pressure to behave a certain way. He does not get the Scoutmaster position back at the end of the episode, despite the fact that public sentiment is now in favor of Big Gay Al's lifestyle. It's a council of 3 old men who are caving to public pressure that's no longer there, that's keeping Stan, Kyle, and the rest from having their preferred Scoutmaster. At the time this episode was written, the same-sex relationships in the United States were illegal, and public sentiment was largely against it. Years later, gay marriage was finally legalized, and within a few years the acceptance rate had improved dramatically, the reasoning being that people will naturally be less opposed to any concept they are exposed to. You can't lie about what gay people are like when the typical American knows a gay person who's not like that. Discrimination can only happen to minorities, or at least what the person doing the discrimination perceives as one. Super Best Friends. After seeing a David Blaine performance, the boys become excited to see one of his magic camps to learn more about him. But at this camp, the leadership repeatedly tells them they are unhappy, and that Blaintology is the only way they can feel good again. Stan recognizes this as a scam and leaves, though Cartman, Kyle, and the rest stick around because of the cult's offerings. Stan then turns to Jesus to convince the people to reject Blaintology, though as Blaine's magic is too powerful, he has to get help from the Super Best Friends, a group of religious figures from various parts of the world. They discover that Blaine is trying to order his followers to drown themselves in the reflecting pool at Washington, D.C. to get tax-exempt status. He animates the statue of Lincoln to fight the Super Best Friends, but they counter with a giant statue of John Wilkes Booth that defeats Blaine's monster and saves the day. In the end, Stan and Kyle reunite as Kyle has realized that his friend was correct, and they convince the cult members that any religion that requires you to pay money to advance is a scam. Later seasons of South Park would draw a lot of negative attention for depicting Muhammad, but when this episode aired, it was barely a blip on most people's radar. It wasn't until years later, when the depiction of Muhammad was heavily publicized, that it finally got the attention of religious groups who wanted the episode removed. The difference in attention mostly comes down to the fact that one was made a big deal behind the scenes, and the other was just, which religious leaders can we put in our show? A lot of whether something is considered offensive comes down to the intention behind the action. Trey and Matt were just showing a bunch of religions coming together to beat up a Scientologist allegory. They weren't doing it to annoy people who worshipped any of the figures shown. Of course, later actions have caused this episode to be reinterpreted in a more negative light. It's one of the few episodes of South Park not to be included on any legal streaming platform as a result of the 200th episode drawing attention to it retroactively. People will often try to assign meaning to actions done in the past based on interpretations of these actions in the future, while ignoring the initial interpretation. And while there's an entire discussion about author intent versus cultural influence that I can't include while keeping the video brief, it's still a shame that something so innocent can later become controversial purely because people were looking for controversy. Scott Tenorman must die. Cartman tries to show off his pubes to his friend, though these pubes are actually hairs he bought from Scott Tenorman, a local teenager. Cartman tries to get his money back, but is first tricked into providing the wrong amount of change, and later tricked into going hundreds of miles away to a fake pube fair, before ultimately having Scott burn the money in front of him. So Cartman plans to get revenge by training a pony to bite off Scott's wiener, though Jimbo tells Cartman he ought to think like a hunter and set a better trap. This trap ends up being a poorly dubbed interview with Scott's favorite band, Radiohead, that Scott interrupts to show a video of Cartman begging for his money back while pretending to be a pig. Something so funny it makes Kenny die of laughter. So Cartman makes a better plan, hosting a big chili cook-off and telling Stan and Kyle that he's going to invite Radiohead and have the pony from before bite his wiener off in front of them. Scott then makes his own plan, getting his parents to rescue the pony while he and his friends make pube chili for Cartman to eat. The day of the fair arrives, and Cartman eats Scott's chili, only to reveal he swapped it out for chef's and that he knew Scott would try to do that. He also reveals the chili that Scott was eating was made after his parents were shot for trespassing on the pony ranch, using their bodies as ingredients. Radiohead then shows up and calls Scott a wuss for crying over having eaten his parents, as Cartman drinks Scott's tears. Probably Cartman's most infamous episode, in which he reacts to getting scammed out of about $16 by killing a boy's parents and making him eat them. I've written a little bit about Cartman as a character before, so I think that for this episode I'll instead focus on how we got here. South Park has always been an absurd show, with crazy things happening at first because Matt and Trey were trying to figure out how much they could get away with, and then later because they had little time to come up with a plot that took itself seriously, and ultimately wound up as a show that was known for being over the top. By this point, South Park had a legacy to live up to. If Kenny doesn't die, people aren't happy. If the stakes of an episode do not escalate to an insane degree, the plot's underwhelming. So we already know that Cartman's back and forth with Scott Tinnerman is going to result in something insane happening. The real twist almost appeared to be the fact that Scott stopped at pubic hair in the chili, instead of having something more elaborate. But I think this also speaks to what made this episode so memorable. Scott Tinnerman was basically just an older Cartman, cracking a zany scheme to get rich quick and then doubling down in a feud against someone 5 years younger than he is. The fact that Cartman is able to interact with a person just like him and, rather than working cooperatively, decides they're worst enemies says more about his character than any amount of parental cannibalism ever could. Terrance and Phillip, behind the blow. Terrance and Phillip are having a live show, but as it's on the same day as an Earth Day celebration, Stan and Kyle only convince the Earth Day people to let them go on the condition that they convince Terrance and Phillip to do a live show in South Park. They sneak backstage in a groupie's pants only to find an overweight Terrance who refuses to do any sort of collaboration with Phillip, as he never cooperated before. They then go to Phillip to convince him to perform, arguing that the people of South Park would be happy to see him do his high-brow performances of Shakespeare. But when these men arrive at the show, they refuse to work together, so the boys have to put on a pre-recorded episode of Behind the Blow as an attempt to salvage what they promised. As the Earth Day people are chasing them around with the blade, Terrance and Phillip watch a documentary about their best moments and realize that their feud was too petty to be worth breaking up over. They agree to get back together and the day is saved, except for Kenny. The documentary on Terrance and Phillip in this episode almost exactly mirrors fan reaction to Terrance and Phillip outside of South Park. That they started out by getting famous for something other than what they expected, a simple Christmas card, turning into a TV show that millions watched every week. Then there's the in-universe Terrance and Phillip TV show that's made fun of as audiences are unsure whether it's a cartoon or real people. Terrance and Phillip originally was a cartoon in-universe, with the flappy mouth thing being a representation of what a low-budget show would look like in the faux-budget South Park. But when they added the Canadian duo as characters in the show, they maintained their appearance, simply explained away as being Canadian. And then their careers keep following this trajectory, having their big film come out the same day as the second season's opener, and annoying fans who honestly thought they wouldn't care. But undeterred, Terrance and Phillip / Matt and Trey kept at it with the bit about the guys farting on each other, and they released the South Park movie, here depicted as the film within the film that simultaneously started the Canadian-American War, while also having never happened because Kenny unwished it all. Cartman Land. Cartman's grandmother dies and he inherits $1 million from her. People ask him what he's going to spend it on, and Cartman declares that he is going to buy a theme park, and then keep it all to himself as he hates long lines. Cartman then spends his time having fun and even running commercials to brag about the fact that no one else is allowed in. Upon hearing this news, Kyle develops a hemorrhoid and then wonders why God would reward Cartman for being a terrible person while seeming to punish him. Kyle and Stan attempt to sneak into the park, though Kyle's hemorrhoid pops on the fence and he gets caught. This scare convinces Cartman to hire a security guard to keep his friends out, but he has to let a few people into the park each day to pay for this guard. Then he has to let more people in to pay for ride maintenance, electricity, and so on, and before soon he is letting thousands of people in each day. After running ads saying people can't get in and then having a limited run of tickets, Cartman Land becomes massively successful, and so Kyle renounces his faith in God. As Cartman Land is no longer fun due to the long lines, Cartman sells it back to its original owner, only to then be told that he owes back taxes, and also recently lost a lawsuit by Kenny's parents after he died on a ride. Stan then shows a crying Cartman being maced by his own security guard, and Kyle's ass heals immediately, causing him once more to find God. If Scott Tinnerman Must Die is the episode that best defines Cartman, then this is the episode that best solidifies his characterization relative to his friends, well, relative to his associates. Classmates, I guess. I mentioned that Cartman meets a person just like him and immediately becomes this guy's worst enemy, so the reason he's never killed any of the parents of his other boys comes down to the fact that they are different from each other, and this is a revelation that comes about so slowly that it finally takes a 5th season episode to really drive home how different these characters are. The first 2 Spirit of Christmas shorts barely characterize any of the kids outside of their physical appearance. Cartman didn't have a personality, he was just the fat one. Stan and Kyle were effectively interchangeable, with little difference between their roles in the plot. More of this distinction was drawn from their hats than how they spoke or even what they said. In any other show, a character developing hemorrhoids because his worst enemy is happy would be seen as excessively on the nose as a Job allegory, and yet here it's practically expected that Kyle's condition is connected to Cartman's, that the harshest test God can put Kyle through is to have something good happen to Cartman. And the worst thing that can happen to Cartman is karma for his own actions. Proper condom use. The kids get in trouble for playing Red Rocket with the family dog during a book club meeting, and when trying to explain why this is wrong, the parents realize they don't know how to explain the concept of sex. So they demand the school starts to teach sex ed at a younger age, in spite of Chef's warnings. Though because Miss Chokesondick and Mr. Mackey don't know what they're doing, these lessons are ineffective. What the kids do pick up on, however, are the lessons on STDs and warnings that they have to wear a condom, so the boys start wearing condoms everywhere, and this causes the adults to panic as they equate the new spike in condom sales to mean they are being used for intercourse. They begin to teach sex ed at younger and younger ages until the boys finally start to blame women for their fear, as the girls blame men for theirs. This results in a Mad Max 2 style war, with an explosion that causes the parents to realize something is wrong. In the end, Chef chastises the parents for pushing sex education onto weirdo teachers from South Park, and they agree to teach their kids themselves, as everyone gathers around to watch Cartman play Red Rocket again. Chef stands in for the opinions of Matt and Trey in this episode, being the level-headed guy who tells the parents how they ought to raise their kids. This would come across as preachy and over-involved if the parents weren't the ones trying to get others to raise their kids for them in the first place. But it's not as though it's advice that ought to be followed blindly in the first place, too. Sure, parents are better at teaching their kids what the parents want them to know, but when it comes to what the kids should know, it is more ambiguous. People thinking like this is how we get the homeschooled kids who think that the earth is flat, or those who don't know how to read in high school. It's because the parents thought that it would be better that way. Sure, adults have the freedom to choose how to raise their children, but this isn't to say that there's an objectively right way to do this, and yet there are still a few objectively wrong decisions you can make. Eventually a kid is going to learn about sexual intercourse. Eventually kids are going to learn about basically everything. So many plots in South Park have been started from the kids making inaccurate assumptions about adult topics because of a lack of information. And when these kids grow curious about what they're seeing in the world, they'll try to satiate this curiosity. It is up to the adults in their lives to make sure that they learn biology from a trustworthy source, since if it's not an adult explicitly trying to teach the subject, then the kids are going to learn about sex from some guy in a trench coat jumping out of a van. Towel-y. In exchange for not asking about a used tampon, the boys get an Okama game sphere from Stan's mom. They stay up playing it while ignoring a sentient towel named Towel-y, who reminds them to bring a towel, and then asks if they want to get high. Some government agents ask about the location of this towel, and later demand they give Towel-y up by taking their console hostage. But when they bring Towley back to Tynacorp where he was made, they are ambushed, as it's revealed the military is after him. It's then revealed that the military wants his TNA to create more Towleys, and that Tynacorp wants to bring him to their HQ to self-destruct. But Towley gets too high to remember how to do this, and after several more double crosses, the boys finally find the game sphere they wanted, playing it as they ignore the escalating stakes involving mutant towels and paramilitary groups fighting alien invaders. The base explodes and Kenny falls into a pit of lava as Towley fights the urge to get high so he can save them, ultimately caving in, but relaxing enough to save the console and the boys. In the end, they all play video games together while calling Towley the worst character ever. Matt and Trey have mentioned in the past how they dislike the monetization and commercialization of South Park, the way that having shelf after shelf full of South Park merchandise feels like a person going into their childhood bedroom and grabbing stuff off the walls. Maybe this is in part because their contracts mean they don't have a lot of control or income from merch sales, but this episode also expresses the general disdain they have for characters introduced explicitly because someone wants to profit off a show. A character who follows the marketable plushie philosophy of character design. If the producers wanted a more monetizable character to include in South Park, Matt and Trey would deliver. They would deliver Towley, intentionally meant to be the worst character they could create and as pointless as possible to any real plot, while still forcing his inclusion into the story. Towley's first inexplicable experience, with everyone inexplicably already knowing who he is. The rapidly escalating plot of this episode all centering around a character who's a MacGuffin, and the fact that his catchphrases are both simple and pointless while also being something that contradicts his marketability ploy by referencing drugs, though hilariously this didn't actually stop Towley from showing up on t-shirts. Osama bin Laden has farty pants. After arriving at school in gas masks and being told they have to send $1 to Afghanistan for class, the boys get a package back that contains a goat. But since none of the boys can raise a goat, they sneak aboard a military jet as the soldiers are convinced that the goat is Stevie Nicks. But when they try to return the animal, the 4 boys who sent it refuse this return, saying that they hate Americans for blowing up everything around them. They are then captured by the Taliban, who take them directly to Osama bin Laden, who uses them to film a propaganda film. But the kids from before sneak in to rescue the boys, saying that if they don't protect innocents, then they are no better than Americans. Cartman stays behind to handle bin Laden himself, attacking him in an homage to 1940s Looney Tunes shorts as the rest of the kids argue over which country is better, before agreeing that maybe one day the Americans can learn to hate everyone too. The United States Army manages to retrieve Stevie Nicks and have her perform at a USO show as the rest of the boys have a patriotic send-off by saying "Go Broncos." After the episode Towley, South Park had their usual mid-season break. Many of the show's staff had trips planned, only for these trips to be cancelled last minute due to the September 11th terrorist attacks. They spent the next few weeks pondering what direction they could possibly take the show upon their return, knowing that they now had a reputation for riffing on recent news stories, but also that recent news stories were too depressing to possibly cover. As they were pondering this issue, a solution appeared. They simply needed to make a popular statement that their entire audience could agree on, a statement no American could look at and make pedantic arguments about controversy, a statement that Osama bin Laden has farty pants. This episode then riffs on the Middle Eastern conflict by intentionally drawing comparisons to the old Looney Tunes wartime shorts, things that even today can be looked upon as patriotism so obvious it defies controversy. It is self-serving and pro-American, but it's hard to argue that it's an attempt at brainwashing the youth, since even kids will understand the clear exaggerations made in the interest of having a black and white moral look in a conflict. Exaggeration for comedic effect is not inherently evil, it's only an issue when you pretend that it isn't happening, something South Park has never made a claim to. How to eat with your butt. On school picture day, Kenny and Cartman play a prank by having Kenny get into his parka backwards to make it look like he has a butt face, which Cartman thinks is the funniest thing ever. He decides to escalate this prank by having Kenny's picture placed on milk cartons so more people can see it. But this causes a couple with torsonic polarity syndrome, or TPS, or butts for their face, to believe that their missing son has been found. They arrive at Cartman's house to search for their kid, but Cartman does not find it funny, worrying that he has blown his funny fuse and can no longer find anything humorous. Meanwhile, the South Park Milk Company uses their database to help the Thompsons find their missing son, as an apology for printing the fake ad, and they manage to track him down, hosting a large event where it's revealed that the missing boy has grown up to be Ben Affleck. Cartman finds this hilarious and realizes that his funny fuse is fixed, though the other boys suspect that he was actually over a feeling of guilt. The idea of people with butts for faces was one of those bits Matt and Trey would make back and forth to each other, similarly to Towley's catchphrase from before. It was never included in South Park until now, as they thought it was too stupid even for their show. But by having the people in universe take the prospect semi-seriously, they were able to show a random bit of maturity in the episode that wound up making the entire thing even more absurd. Butters spins this entire episode grounded for making a silly face during school pictures, a misdirect as he was posing normally, and the audience is led to think that it was Kenny, about to get in trouble for the same thing. This is the first time we really meet Butters' parents as people instead of props for crowd shots, as the showrunners realize the comedic potential for exploring how a character like Butters became the type of person he is. Likewise, this episode brings back Jimmy for another role in trying to make Cartman laugh. In Matt and Trey's own words, during the second half of Season 5, they learned that Jimmy really has legs. The Entity. Tired of the long wait times due to post-9/11 paranoia, Mr. Garrison decides to produce a new form of transportation he calls IT. IT has a grand unveiling ceremony, with investors from all over the country coming together to see this new invention. A gyroscopic device operated by something only Garrison could come up with. Realizing it still beats putting up with the airlines, people flock to the IT dealership and Garrison becomes rich, until the US government arrives and trashes the place as a bailout for the airlines. Kyle is hosting his cousin, Kyle, a Jewish stereotype that immediately gets on his nerves. He tries to pay Cartman $40 not to make fun of him, but when that fails, conspires to physically get rid of him. In the end, Kyle leaves of his own volition after revealing he made $5 million cashing out his IT investment, and he returns home, calling out the boys for being stereotypical rednecks. IT from this episode is based off of the invention that would eventually become the Segway. Before its unveiling, only vague rumors were hinted at, as most of the advertising was about the investors excited about the new device, as well as the fact that it would revolutionize transport. Of course, the average reception to anyone outside of a tour group was similar to Matt and Trey's own experience after buying one. They tried to ride it up a skateboard ramp and then it broke, and then they never bothered to fix it. But here the hype is combined with the still topical idea of airport security being absurd and ineffective, something that was supposed to be a temporary measure for security that's still around over 2 decades later. And we get several jokes about quadruple penetration being better than traveling on airlines, with a bit of criticism for the government for first kneecapping efficiency in air travel with the regulations, then proceeding to pass the bill for the loss of cash flow to taxpayers. If something challenges transportation norms, it's quickly shut down. If the norms themselves challenge themselves, everything else gets shut down anyway. The other plot in this episode, making the entity a double entendre, is the other Kyle. He is all of the Jewish stereotypes that Cartman pretends that Kyle, the original, is, and his mere existence is something that makes Kyle embarrassed to be Jewish. Matt and Trey didn't make him to be anti-Semitic so much as they created the character to express the exasperation of any person who meets somebody they share a demographic with, that then gives that demographic a bad name. From a dude bro calling women femoids, making people ashamed to be male, or people who watch South Park while idolizing Cartman, not realizing they are the butt of the joke. Here comes the neighborhood. Token is being made fun of by the other kids in South Park for being rich, so he tries to ask his parents if they can buy cheaper clothes and own worse things. But when this fails and he is still not accepted, he resolves instead to get more friends like him, and invites several prominent rich families to move to South Park. These families begin moving to South Park in large numbers, prompting the poorer residents to start harassing them to go back to where they came from. This is done by burning lowercase t's in their lawns for time to leave, and dressing up as ghosts, because rich folks hate ghosts. But Token still doesn't have what he wants, and the new rich kids are too rich, and he can't relate to the other children. So he decides to live with the lions instead, but the Lion King Aslan keeps making bad jokes, and Token realizes that he was better off with his old friends all along. They accept him back, saying that while they made fun of him, they also made fun of everyone else, and the rich folks leave South Park because they think it's haunted. There are some issues in Western culture that are practically guaranteed to get people angry and defensive if there so much is mentioned. One of these issues is mentioned here, the idea that racial prejudice of the past still has long-lasting effects on the present. That excluding certain groups has blocked generational wealth from accumulating, meaning that there are people who have never personally participated in this systemic discrimination, who have nevertheless benefited from others mistreating minority groups. So simply trying to explain how historical racism has shaped our modern landscape generates a defensive response from some people who then proceed to make any future progress impossible because they won't acknowledge there's a problem. South Park is able to discuss controversial issues with their usual ability to make fun of both sides, while also managing to avoid the easily offended groups writing angry letters through a process that's referred to as mapping. Mapping is effectively an extended metaphor, comparing one issue to another and then continuing that comparison to a logical extreme through the less controversial lens. This sort of writing allows for people who would normally refuse to hear out a specific argument out of principle to instead accept the facts laid out in front of them, and South Park's humor makes this twice as palatable. This is an episode about racism that simultaneously depicts the actions as they occur, while also presenting a world where burning lowercase t's and dressing as a ghost are considered innocent acts. Kenny dies. Cartman finds an overturned truck full of aborted fetuses while riding his bike and excitedly tries to sell them to various research labs. But this is interrupted when the research on stem cells is banned by the US government, and Kenny gets dangerously ill with a degenerative muscle disease. The kids are pulled out of class to go visit him, but as Stan dislikes hospitals and doesn't like seeing Kenny with so many tubes, he doesn't say anything and leaves early. Cartman then decides to do something about Kenny's death and returns to the laboratory to learn more about stem cell research, eventually resolving to visit Congress himself to convince them to lift the ban by singing Asia's The Heat of the Moment. Stan finally gets over his fear and visits Kenny, only to learn that he passed away in the night while asking where Stan was. Stan starts to cry because he couldn't be there for his friend when he needed him, but at his funeral, Cartman pulls them all away to show the boys a miracle, that he has taken the stem cells he's been canvassing for and managed to reconstruct a Shakey's pizza of his own. Killing Kenny every single episode was starting to get tiring for Matt and Trey, but it was the expectation that it would happen, as that's the way the series has always been, to the point that not killing Kenny at the end of the episode was subversive. "Oh my god, they killed Kenny" was effectively one of the show's slogans by this point, but to the showrunners it felt gratuitous. And sure, a lot of South Park was gratuitous in the first place, but they at least tried to keep things fresh. So they needed to find a way to stop killing Kenny without so many people asking why they stopped or speculating about some sort of behind-the-scenes pressure that Matt and Trey allegedly caved to. Their solution came from an old Monty Python anecdote. Once upon a time, the minds behind the British comedy show speculated on a theoretical script that would take itself entirely seriously. They would make an episode of Flying Circus with no jokes, building up to comedic beats, but refusing to tell the obvious joke where there would be one. This itself would be the joke, but they weren't sure if they could pull it off while treading the line between so unfunny it's funny and so unfunny it's unfunny. They never went through with this idea, but the fact that it was planned in the first place gave Matt and Trey the idea to at least parody the concept by going long stretches without jokes, bits that drag on, and then one subversive ending anyway. Just when Cartman announces his miracle at the end of the episode, the viewer is likely to have forgotten what show they're watching, and so the ending beat of Cartman cloning a pizza restaurant surprises viewers by playing the series' usual beats straight. Butters' very own episode. It's the anniversary of Linda and Stephen Scotch, Butters' parents, and they've prepared a family trip to Bennigan's to celebrate. But Linda's worried that her anniversary gift isn't going to be as good as Stephen's, so she asks Butter to tail him and find out where he's been shopping. Butters discovers that his dad is going to porno theaters and gay bathhouses, and when he brings the pictures back to his mother, she goes mad. Stephen tries to convince Butters not to tell his mother about what he saw, but he reveals that she already knows, and then Linda tries to drown him in the car. Butters survives and makes the long walk back home, hitchhiking for some of the trip and heading down suspicious old roads. But back in South Park, Linda and Stephen join a support group for other couples with missing children after they lie about some Puerto Rican guy being the assailant. But just when the Scotch family starts to scream at each other about their story falling apart, Butters returns home, and they decide to come clean about everything as Butters tells one more lie about being okay. Butters' parents blame some Puerto Rican guy for kidnapping their son to cover up his disappearance, knowing that even back in 2001, leaning into racial prejudices could allow people to get away with murder. The FBI puts an extremely vague description out for the man, knowing that people will be quick to jump on the bandwagon of xenophobia, looking for a simple answer that plays into prejudices rather than thinking logically about what happened. The problem with jumping to conclusions, though, is that people rarely jump back. Of course, this exact thing happened to Matt and Trey in their inclusion of John and Patsy Ramsey, at the time having done a similar thing to Linda and Stephen Scotch in blaming a home invader for their child's death, one of the many instances of pulling a story from the news in their writing. Of course, the problem with pulling stories from the news is that you end up writing about speculation from the first person to break the story instead of the ones who took their time to do research. Advancements in DNA evidence later exonerated the Ramseys as it proved that somebody actually did break into their house. Matt and Trey at least did apologize after the fact, which puts them above a lot of other politically involved types who have a tendency to double down when they're proven wrong. This will prove to be a continuing source of conflict in South Park going forward, the desire to keep the show topical competing with the fact that DVDs are forever, and once you make a statement, you can't really take it back. Outro. This video is a part 1 to what will likely be a 4-ish part series covering South Park. I like to give myself a little break between videos on the same subject so I don't burn out on a topic and give less attention than I ought to, which means that part 2 to this video covering seasons 6 through maybe 10 will come out not next month but the month after, so April 1st. Or maybe you are watching this after the fact and part 2 is already released, in which case expect part 3 on June 1st, assuming that nothing goes wrong with scheduling. The best way to make sure that you get this video recommended as soon as it's out is to subscribe, but I'm sure you already know that. I'm not going to beg or anything. Anyway, this segment of the video will be cut out of the full version to be released in like August or maybe later, so what I'm saying here isn't super important. If you are listening to this video in the background while doing something else, this is your warning to start looking for another video. Obviously, I am biased, but I would recommend that you watch one of my other videos since they are similar to this one. So anyway, with nothing left to say, screw you guys, I'm going home.